Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Saiduddin Faridi, and I'll be your MC for the event today. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I would like to welcome you all to today's keynote address on the Quad and public goods in an era of multilateralism, opportunities, and challenges, and the following panel discussion, which is titled Climate Diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. To begin with today's proceedings, I would first like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, to deliver the welcome remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I welcome you to today's keynote address on the Quad and public goods in an era of multilateralism, opportunities and challenges, and the following panel discussion on climate diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. I hope you will forgive me. I'm going to have to look at my screen because I've just come out of another panel organized by ISAS on RCEP, so I don't want to mix RCEP and the Quad up. So I'm going to stick to the script for once in my life. Now, as a research institute, ISAS focuses on contemporary South Asia. We study how South Asian countries are negotiating their position in the evolving world order, one that is increasingly being defined by the crisis of multilateralism, the rise of minilateral arrangements, and plurilateral arrangements. Thus, the Quad and the strategic framing of the Indo-Pacific more broadly is of immense interest to us as an institute. At the same time, we are located in Southeast Asia. Thus, we look at South Asia in a broader perspective and are attentive to the impact of the strategic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic choices made by countries like India in a region of namely Southeast Asia, where there's increasing US-China competition and India-China competition for influence as well. And as I like to say it, we leverage our expertise in South Asia and our unique position in Southeast Asia to provide new perspectives on South Asia. Now, today's back-to-back events focus on critical issues in the Indo-Pacific, including the emergence of what we now term as minilateralism, the provision of public goods at a regional level, and climate change and climate action, which are increasingly important in the realms of international cooperation and diplomacy. The recent joint statement issued by member states of the Quad signal how the Quad will be pitching itself going forward. The joint statement drew attention to what were defined as practical initiatives, such as the Partnership for Cable Connectivity and Resilience, and an increasing focus on climate action. Now, this is not totally new. For those who've been observing the Quad, we know that in 2021, a number of working groups were announced. This included the Quad Vaccine Expert Groups, the Quad Climate Working Group. So in today's keynote and the subsequent discussion, it's probably worth considering what this new recent emphasis on public goods substantially indicates. Are we seeing something new, or is it repackaging? Now, this should also be located within the terrain of the fact that non-traditional security issues are not secondary anymore. They've come to the fore. So these are particularly important in the Indo-Pacific. If we look at the Pacific countries, for instance, and I won't go into this, I don't want to preempt any of the discussions. But I like to emphasize that the joint statement also had another aspect to it, which was the emphasis on the importance and centrality of ASEAN, but also the need for the Quad to engage ASEAN. Now, this, of course, as I'm probably speaking to those who are very familiar with this issue, is a recognition on the part of the Quad of the discomfort among some or most ASEAN countries about the need to choose between US and China, but also increasingly India and China as well. And there's also the concern over the splitting of the ASEAN over this issue. Thus, we should focus on that in this discussion as well, but we should also bear in mind that this new emphasis on public goods and this new emphasis on engagement with ASEAN is also a reflection of differing positions within the Quad countries themselves about what the Quad is, what exactly it should do, and how it should deal with security issues. And so this is another aspect that we should focus upon, because it also provides perhaps an answer to the broader question of what exactly is the Quad. This is the perennial question we keep grappling with. Will the Quad, through the provision of public goods, actually develop institutions that could then institutionalize the Quad in some ways? So that's another question I'm throwing up. Of course, this should all feed into the question of the impact of the focus on public goods and climate. Will the provision of public goods increase the appeal of the Quad? Could we perhaps see a more concerted effort at standard setting and perhaps about the regulation of the blue economy, which surely is at the heart of climate issues? Now, independent of the Quad, climate diplomacy is increasingly becoming important. Countries across the Indo-Pacific are crafting new forms of climate partnerships. They're also dealing with the interconnected nature of addressing climate issues. At a broader level, the whole very question of green transition requires a reform of multilateral institutions and financial structures. So I see both the keynote address and the subsequent panel discussion of today as being critical to think and rethink how regional architectures can be wired to address critical public goods challenges. Now, I won't say any more because I want to hand the floor over to the keynote speaker, but I would like to do the most important thing, which I'm here for to do, is to thank people. And I'd like to thank Dr. Christy Gavella, Director, Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs, Assistant Professor, Asian Studies, University of Hawaii in the United States, for delivering the keynote address for today's event. I would also like to express my gratitude to the panel of esteemed scholars and researchers who are joining us today for sharing their views and taking the time to be part of this discussion. Lastly, I would like to thank the research team at ISAS, which is very ably led by Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, and the event staff for putting together the events of today. With that, like all of you, I look forward to a productive and engaging afternoon. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Sivya. We will now commence with the keynote address, and I would like to request Dr. Christy Govella to please take her place at the podium. Dr. Govella is the director at the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs and Assistant Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii. I would also request Dr. Kei Koga, who will be chairing the session, to join us on stage. Dr. Koga is Associate Professor at the School of Social Sciences at the Nanyang Technological University.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you very much to the Institute of South Asian Studies and National University of Singapore for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be able to share some of the work that I've been doing on the Quad lately and to focus on its public goods agenda. So I wanted to start out by saying just a few words to frame the discussion and how I'm thinking about this topic. So of course, I'm going to focus on the Quad today. That's what I was invited to speak about. But I'm also, in my comments, going to think about the Quad as a broader microcosm of regional and global trends, because I think that the emergence of the Quad really reflects a lot of changes that we see in the region and in the international system today. And I also think that the Quad is struggling with a lot of issues that many other organizations are in its agenda and in its aims. So there are two questions that I'm going to come back to repeatedly throughout the keynote remarks today. The first is, how can small groups of like-minded countries like the Quad address complex cross-border problems? And the second is, can groups like the Quad provide public goods while also serving the strategic interests of their members that brought them together in the first place? So to give you an overview of the remarks, I'll start by talking a little bit about the regional and international context, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but I think it will really help to ground the discussion in a broader setting. I'll talk briefly about the evolution of the Quad and how we got to where we are today, and then I'll focus on several examples of the Quad as a potential provider of public goods, looking at health, climate change, maritime issues, and also critical and emerging technologies. And then I'll talk about what we learn about the opportunities and challenges for the future based on these examples from the Quad, and then conclude with some of the implications for broader regional and global cooperation, including what this potentially means for countries that are not members of the Quad. So a lot of my remarks today are going to draw on a set of 3 reports that I worked on when I was the Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We had an ongoing program looking at Quad issues. We did one report that was looking basically at internal cohesion amongst the 4 countries. We talked to a lot of policymakers from the 4 countries at the time, and we're really trying to understand what was happening institutionally. And then we also did 2 different projects looking at potential for third-party countries to collaborate with the Quad. And we had the chance to talk to many people from inside the region and also from Europe and other places who are really watching the emergence of the Quad and wondering what it meant for them. Was this something they should worry about? Was this something that they could, usefully leverage? And so it's exciting to be able to bring this research here and also to update it for what's happened for the last couple of years. So just to outline a little bit about the international and regional context, and I think it's clear to all of us that we're in a time of incredibly challenging cross-border dynamics. We're thinking about huge problems like climate change and health. We're in a time when the governance of the international system is really challenged by conflicts in places like Ukraine. And so if we think about spaces in the world like the maritime domain or outer space, we can also see that they're becoming, as people say, increasingly congested, contested, and competitive as new actors emerge and as different forms of conflict and tension arise. And I think we also are all aware of the context of intensifying geopolitical competition. So, there's a lot happening right now, and these are very big international global problems. And at the same time, we're in an era where seems to be a lack of consensus about what the international or regional order should be. And there are new ideas arising. So, part of that has caused dissatisfaction with some actors about existing institutions and a search for new cooperative mechanisms. So this isn't necessarily new. This is kind of the latest phase, this era of minilateralism that I'm going to talk about today. So let's take a step back for the moment and let's see how can we understand the development of Asia's regional institutional architecture prior to this point. So I'm sure that many of you know this context, but just briefly, thinking about the post-World War II period, Asia has often been commented on as a place that had a relative lack of formal institutions for people who like to compare Asia to the EU or things like this. But it has had, institutions of different kinds that have really served as a foundation for different kinds of cooperation. Many people point to the hub and spokes bilateral alliance system with the US as one of these kinds of structures. And then if we think about, the region on its own, there has been the emergence of a series of regional organizations, starting in 1967 with the formation of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, first as a security grouping and then expanding its agenda and its membership. And then as we moved into the late 80s and as the end of the Cold War came, we started talking about the Pacific Rim, and Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum came into being, focusing on trade and trade liberalization. And that had a much broader vision of the region, one that included the US, also South American countries. And so that was a very different vision. And then, of course, in 1994, we had the creation of the ASEAN Regional Forum, which broadened the definition of the region even further and took a look at non-traditional security issues, maritime issues, et cetera. And then as we got past the 1997 financial crisis, there started to be a demand for, smaller formats. And so we saw this movement towards ASEAN +3, which brought together the 10 ASEAN countries, China, Japan, and South Korea. And that focused a lot on financial cooperation, like the Chiang Mai Initiative, et cetera. And then we got the creation of the East Asia Summit, which then broadened that back out again to include Australia, New Zealand, and India, and later incorporated the US and Russia. So, we think of this as sort of the pre-existing institutional architecture that people have become comfortable with in the region, which is layered over again these bilateral alliances. But, it's worth noting that at every point in the development of this architecture, there have been debates about new institutions, their membership, their agenda, and their characteristics. And this has been true throughout this period. There were people who were, excited about these institutions coming into being, and there were people who weren't that excited. And there were many institutions that were blocked from coming into creation or that did not emerge. So, we have to remind ourselves that there's really no natural definition of the region. So each new addition of an institution is seen as a potential attempt to influence its identity and the way that it works. And so the institutions are shaped by regional dynamics, and they also shape these regional dynamics. So of course, there are many, many more institutions that actually exist in Asia in specific issue areas, like if we looked at trade, but these are some of the big ones. So I'm here today to talk about minilateralism. So why do we see a push for new institutions when we have all of these great institutions already in existence that could be used? So I think that, of course, we understand that, as I said, regional dynamics shape institutions, and the emergence of intensifying US-China competition has really put pressure on these broad institutions and made it more difficult to reach compromises or to discuss issues meaningfully inside them. I think also some countries would claim that there are changing needs, and they would claim that broad regional institutions like the ones I mentioned, and also like the United Nations or the WTO, et cetera, are too slow, that they can't address rapidly evolving crises, that they're inflexible, and these types of things. So for these kinds of complaints, there's been a turn to minilaterals. And the idea is that minilaterals are more informal, more flexible, and more focused on specific functional issues. So potentially they could be quicker to act. Now, interestingly, a bunch of the ASEAN-related organizations I mentioned are actually pretty informal in some ways in comparison to more formal formats. But these are even more informal and even more flexible. And the focus on so-called like-minded partners is an attempt to basically bring together countries that are already aligned in an attempt to facilitate quick action. So because we're talking about the Quad today, I'll focus a little bit more on US policy, but the US is not the only actor driving these minilaterals forward. But over the course of the Trump and Biden administrations, for different reasons, we've seen the US turn towards these small formats. So for the Trump administration, it was really about a broad and deep suspicion of multilateral institutions. The administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement, it withdrew from the TPP, et cetera, with the idea that these were not good agreements for the US. And so it really focused on bilateral agreements, on smaller formats. And it really was pursuing this, particularly the Quad, out of an idea of competition with China. Whereas in the Biden administration, you get the same tendency, but it's kind of motivated by a different sort of logic. So when I was in DC, we would do a lot of talks with officials, and we would constantly hear this refrain about letting the agenda guide the choice of forum instead of the forum determining the agenda. And so the idea that they wanted to focus on functional issues and getting stuff done versus talking about broad issues in particular. And if you think about the other big goal of the Biden administration, which is networking allies and partners, then a small minilateral format also makes a lot of sense because, it's basically trying to build up from bilateral or small structures into trilateral and broader senses of cooperation. So these two administrations are very different, but across both of them, we did see a push for small format cooperation. And so the result of all these different trends has been a surge in bilaterals and a surge in what people sometimes refer to as minilaterals, these very small minilaterals, because actually some people would call like ASEAN plus 3 a minilateral, but these very small formats. So trilaterals, we think about AUKUS, we think about all kinds of different formats, particularly, for example, the Japan, South Korea, US trilateral has gotten a lot of attention over the last year or so. We're going to talk about the Quad, which is not the only quadrilateral. We've also seen things like the CHIP4 or FAB4, all kinds of other formats, and then also broader groupings. But really, these small formats. We've seen this actually before in the realm of trade, which I also work on. So when you get stagnation at the broad level of cooperation, countries or actors push forward and they go narrow and they go small to try to cooperate. And so again, this is not necessarily new. So now with that context in mind, let's think a little bit about the evolution of the Quad and how we got here today before we go into the issue of public goods provision. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this background, but of course, the Quad first emerged in 2004 in the aftermath of the Indian Ocean tsunami, when this core group of the US, Australia, India, and Japan came together for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief purposes. And then, the idea of the cooperation among the 4 countries was being floated by people like former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and others out of an idea that they shared interests and values and that there would be some kind of value to greater cooperation. We then saw an exploratory meeting in 2007. The 4 countries conducted a maritime exercise in the Bay of Bengal, for example. But eventually, by the end of 2007, the organization was already faltering due to criticism from China that it had, a purpose in containing China or countering China, due to changes of leadership, particularly in Japan and Australia. And, in general, due to a lack of cohesion and a lack of habit of the countries working together, because this was a very new endeavor. So that could have been the end of the Quad as we know it back in 2007. But then, of course, we get its resurgence in 2017 when it becomes very much intertwined with the rise of the Indo-Pacific as a political concept in Japan and also in the US. And then we have its agenda, including things like counterterrorism, maritime security, infrastructure, for example. But during this point in time, the Quad as such was still a relatively fragmented organization. It was notable that senior officials were meeting and eventually foreign ministers met as well. But there were no joint statements at this point in time. Each country would release statements about whatever issue it wanted to emphasize the most. So it was, cohesive in relative to the Quad 1.0, but still pretty fragmented. Then, of course, with the advent of the Biden administration in 2021, this becomes elevated in scope and ambition and also in relative formality. So we have the first Leader Summit in 2021, and then we have the creation of the working groups that were mentioned already. So with the creation of these working groups, we also got an expanded focus on public goods and the idea that the Quad was going to deliver benefits to the region, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And since that time, we've seen a lot of momentum around the Quad in terms of meetings, which have been regularized at many different levels. We see joint statements, and these working groups have really become quite busy. So as I mentioned, the working group structure included things like health, climate, critical and emerging technologies, infrastructure, cybersecurity, and space, as well as other things. And then, in addition to this core structure, they've had the advent of a ton of other subgroups, dialogues, different kinds of initiatives that have emerged. So the Quad is still an informal organization, but it has quite a bit more structure than it did certainly in the last two iterations. And, by starting these working groups, it's really regularized contact around these subjects in a way that wasn't possible before. So this really has been a significant expansion in agenda and a significant broadening in scope. So all of this in Quad 3.0 has really been about reframing the Quad as a so-called positive force for the region. And so the most immediate trigger of this was really demonstrating the ability to respond to China's global vaccine diplomacy. Again, we have to think about, early 2021 and what was happening. And so the four countries getting together to demonstrate that they had something to offer the region vis-a-vis what China was doing was really seen as important and, spoke to the concerns of the countries and their people at that moment. It was also a response to criticisms from ASEAN countries and other countries in the Pacific that the Quad really seemed to be an exclusionary grouping and that, it really didn't care about the region as such, that it wasn't addressing the meaningful issues in the region. And so the expansion to issues like health and climate change really seemed to speak more directly to those basic needs. So has it been successful? Well, we're still assessing that clearly. So let's look at some examples. And as I said, I'll go through a few different issue areas. But really what we're trying to do here is to assess, how has the Quad done as a provider of public goods? So when we assess Quad activities, I think it's very important to think about what we're looking at in the Quad. It's an informal organization and it has a lot of different dimensions of engagement. So I think it's useful to think of different depths of engagement from shallow to deep. So we can think about consultation between the countries, which is essentially exchanging information to increase awareness, which perhaps sounds very basic, but in some areas like cybersecurity and other things, actually information exchange can be quite difficult and, it's very important. We can think about coordination as the next deeper stage. So this is, structuring national policies in complementary ways or deconflicting national policies. So not necessarily directly working together, but trying to align separate national policies in ways that make them add up to more than the sum of their parts. And we can think about cooperation as the deepest level. So working together through joint action to achieve a common aim. At the same time, we can also think of different breadths of engagement from narrow to broad. And so actually in the Quad, although it is a grouping of four countries, we often see initiatives at the bilateral, trilateral, and quadrilateral levels. So again, we can think about these two different levels, so depth and breadth. So I think overall, across many examples that I won't have time to talk about today across all the working groups. What we see is that really at the bilateral consultation level, that's really exploded amongst the countries. So at the most shallow and most narrow level, we see quite a lot of action. And then, there's an attempt to expand out to really make it fully quadrilateral and to really move into joint action. But that is, of course, the most difficult. And also, it doesn't really always make sense, depending what the issue is. So, because it's a functional grouping, sometimes coordination can be more impactful than direct cooperation. And so what we see across all of the organizations is really, again, this concentration in, lower levels of engagement, but also some progress towards expansion. So let's start with health as one example. I'll talk about health, climate, marine issues, maritime issues, and then critical and emerging technologies finally. So with the vaccine partnership and health, as I was saying in my comments about the Quad 3.0, this was really the first major test of the Quad's public goods promises. And it was interesting when I was in DC hearing how much of an intense focus there was amongst the governments early in this Quad 3.0 phase to deliver the vaccines. There was just an intense amount of effort and kind of personnel time in trying to make sure that this happened. And the basic idea was cooperation with a division of labor, as I'm sure many people remember. So India was supposed to use its existing capacities to expand vaccine production. The US and Japan would provide financing for various parts of this expansion, and Australia would finance and also do last mile delivery support with a focus on Southeast Asia. And of course, these countries were already doing bilateral things on their own and had their own focuses on different parts. So this was supposed to be a coordination, but also kind of on top of those efforts. So of course, everything related to the pandemic was very challenging. There were many challenges. There were production delays due to increases in COVID-19 cases in India that prioritized basically domestic production over that for export. There were issues related to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that were unforeseen. There were limitations due to the production facility that were chosen. And of course, the pandemic just evolved constantly and caused problems for everybody. So this was, understandable and probably predictable in some ways. But the Quad, did deliver. Vaccines were successfully distributed to some parts of the region. Some of these were done bilaterally. Some were done through the Quad, more bilaterally than through the Quad. They were fewer than the 1 billion doses that were initially promised. But you did see, the full range of the consultation, coordination, and cooperation that I was talking about. And I think it was an important learning experience for the 4 countries in terms of trying to coordinate very quickly in a rapidly changing situation. So I think there was institutional capacity building that emerged out of this vaccine partnership effort. What's next for this? Of course, COVID-19 is perhaps behind us. And so what's next for Quad health cooperation? Well, the idea is to build on this and to look at future health security issues. So strengthening prevention, detection, and response to disease outbreaks. So this is a continuation and an extension of the public goods idea. And of course, for Asia, where pandemic disease, was not new during COVID-19, we can remember SARS, avian influenza, swine flu, all of these things. We know that pandemic disease happens and will reoccur. So this could be a potentially important contribution. Specifically, they talked about things like pooling efforts around surveillance, workforce training, capacity building, data, all of these things that do need improvement. And, planning for pandemic preparedness exercises. So, it remains to be seen, I think, by many people. There is some skepticism that health will remain a long-term pillar or it will be prioritized. But it does have a lot of good potential in terms of public goods provision, because again, this is something that affects, people in the region, it affects individuals and societies, and is seen as, a relatively sort of benevolent effort by the group. So it is difficult with health. It always seems to drop off the priorities when a pandemic is not knocking down your door and demanding that you address it. But this is something where they've had limited success. And I think the test for it will be, the extent to which they really make good the promise to continue on it. Moving on to climate. Of course, climate is a huge issue, but there's been this focus on mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And it was announced at the same time as the focus on health. So why climate? I mean, I think you can point to the domestic agendas of several of the countries and the way that climate has risen over the years in importance. But of course, the salience for the region was quite strong. And you think about places like the Pacific Islands or parts of Southeast Asia, climate change is an existential issue. It's a real present issue and not one for someday down the road, but one that is actually already causing changes in their countries and territories. So there are so many different climate efforts, but I think, one thing that we can look at is the QChamp, the Quad Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Package that kind of summarizes a lot of these lines of efforts. So, on mitigation, there's been talk about things like green shipping, clean hydrogen and ammonia, energy supply chains, carbon markets, knowledge sharing on things that subnational units like cities or provinces are doing, for example. And on adaptation and resilience, we've seen, the efforts to kind of improve climate information, smart agriculture, also marine ecosystem adaptation. So, climate is not only affecting global warming, but it's also affecting the oceans, it's affecting fish stocks, it's affecting, a lot of different things. So this is a very broad agenda. It's also a set of things that in some ways, somebody could look at it and say, well, these are really global issues. So why is a group of 4 trying to tackle them? But, there's been this approach of trying to align policies, trying to experiment with new ideas. So if you look at, for example, reports on this initiative, there are a lot of different programs that are sort of aligned under them. Many of them are unilateral national programs or bilateral programs, but it is a long list of measures. We've seen on climate coordination too, this has been a big approach to basically try to align the services or the sort of resources of the countries to produce, again, something that is a little bit more of the sum of their parts. So on information services, we've seen Australia, India, Japan, and the US try to leverage systems that they're most familiar with and try to bring those resources together. Also, on the most recently announced Indo-Pacific Oceans Research Alliance, we see, scientific organizations engaged with oceans trying to collaborate more. So, this is not necessarily, again, a full-on cooperative effort where there is a deliverable, but there are efforts to sort of align and to increase communication, which is a step towards that. So what can we say? Well, I think with climate, at least for the Quad, concrete measurable outcomes have not necessarily been specified that can be met or not met at this point. And we know that climate problems are very difficult to solve, if not impossible. But I think that we can certainly see that there's been an increase in consultation and coordination across the groups, some bilateral cooperation, fewer signs of truly quadrilateral cooperation. But this kind of building block or expansion approach does seem to be basically what's being taken. To talk about some different issues, I'm going to move over to maritime domain awareness. But I think that one point I'll make before shifting over is that some of the issues that the Quad works on, I think, are more straightforwardly public goods issues where they are really about benefits for the region. Others, I would say, are sort of dual purpose in the sense that they can serve the region and benefit it, but they also have a strategic purpose. So for example, in maritime domain awareness, the idea here is that it's aimed at bringing satellite-based radio frequency data to regional partners in places like Southeast Asia, the Pacific, or the Indian Ocean region, and basically to give these countries a better idea of what is happening in their maritime spaces, which could be good for preventing illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, addressing climate change concerns, responding to natural disasters, or dealing with different kinds of fisheries crimes like trafficking, for example. And so that would be a public goods contribution to the region. But also, strategically speaking, there are, military reasons that one would want to know what's going on in the oceans that can also be enhanced by this. So it's a little bit of a mixed case, I would say. How has the Quad been doing? This is a more recent announcement. There has been, I would say, less demonstrated cooperation. So it has provided data on, for example, electronic emissions from vessels to the Sea Vision data management database, which is managed by the U.S. Department of Transportation. But, some people would criticize that, well, that was already available, that database was already available, et cetera. So I think that, one of the challenges with maritime domain awareness is that there are a lot of initiatives out there in the region, and trying to coordinate them and trying to bring them and to add value is actually challenging. So I'd say that this is very much to be decided and to be watched. But overall, we do see efforts to increase consultation, increase coordination across the countries. So the last example I'll talk about is critical and emerging technologies. And here, again, I would say it's kind of a dual purpose aim. So there is a public goods component, which they would frame as ensuring that innovation is consistent with a free, open, inclusive, and resilient Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, there is also a strategic interest in preventing critical and emerging technologies from being dominated by actors that could be considered suspicious. So a lot of this arose out of concerns about dependence on Chinese supply chains, interdependence with China, and things like semiconductors, for example, or in undersea cables. So, it is framed as public goods, and that is certainly true, but there is also, another purpose. So I think in this area, we've seen the strongest focus on standards and principles, and there has been quite a lot of activity around this, again, in setting out these principles that are usually based on things like transparency, security, reliability, all of these kinds of things. So we've seen the release of, for example, the Quad principles on technology, design, development, governance, and use. We've seen principles for supply chain security, a memorandum of cooperation on supplier diversification for 5G and also Open RAN. We've seen principles on tech standards. And so a lot of this, is basically trying to develop basic principles that can be built upon across the region that will shape these technologies in ways that are considered to be more favorable for the public good and also for the countries that are participating. In terms of implementation, we've seen some signs that is starting. For example, there was a plan announced in 2023 to deploy Open RAN in Palau. We've also seen the Quad produce security reports on some of these technologies in order to kind of provide information for the public, which could be construed as public goods. And overall, I think that in that big chart that I showed about all the different working groups, there are also connections across the working groups. So the cybersecurity working group is also connected to critical and emerging technologies. And there has been quite a lot of activity in that as well. So, what can we say about this? I think that, there's been a tremendous amount of activity in terms of consultation, coordination, and some cooperation in critical and emerging technologies. It's a really fast evolving area, and the strongest focus has been on principles and standards to date. And for people who work on these technologies, that is a critical area. We've seen more limited implementation, but that is also kind of ramping up. So another thing about the technology work is that we've seen a lot of engagement, not only at the state level, but with the private sector and with non-governmental organizations. So that's also an important level of building for the institution. So I think there's a lot of questions about critical and emerging technologies. I think that one that comes up in the dialogues I've been part of are always about how to prioritize the various technologies, where to put your energy in. And countries, sometimes have different intensities of preferences for different technologies. There's been a lot of talk lately about the Quad Investor Network and how this is going to link up and provide potential resources for technological development, which has a lot of promise and would help take it really to that next stage of implementation and development. And then, of course, how does this connect with other initiatives, which is the question that we'll come back to across the other examples too. But obviously, there are a lot of different parties talking about critical and emerging technologies in other minilaterals in Asia, in Europe, across the regions, for example. So, there's a lot of questions about how this sort of builds. So, that brings us to the question of what do these examples really tell us about the opportunities and challenges for the Quad for the future? Especially thinking about this sort of public goods provision angle. So what can we learn essentially? Well, I think that, when you look at the examples, and we've had a few years now of being able to observe the Quad and what it's done, we see that it really does seem to hew quite closely to this flexible, informal, functional nature. I mean, the agenda has really exploded. So it's not really narrowly functionally focused, but within the different kinds of working groups, there is a very specific issue that they're working on and trying to kind of make progress in. And you see them kind of adapt the form that is the most sensical for what they're trying to do. You also see opportunities being taken advantage of to kind of pilot or test new ideas in this format and to work out new concepts. I think you also clearly see a gradual deepening from consultation to coordination to cooperation in some areas, as well as a broadening from the bilateral to the quadrilateral gradually. So I think there are signs of, trust building and deeper institutionalization in terms of the function, even though it's still a relatively informal organization. So I think that, as you go forward, you would expect to see sort of a shift from what I said in the more kind of narrow and shallow forms of engagement towards the broader. So I think when you think about that process for the Quad, that tends to suggest that, there is the potential for a so-called building block or stepping stone approach, that the Quad can not only sort of deepen its engagement and broaden it internally, but that it can also bridge Quad initiatives with broader initiatives and try to build broader coalitions. That does not mean expanding the Quad, but that may mean, trying to take ideas that originate in the Quad and bringing in additional actors as necessary. I think also what it means is that, when we think about how the Quad relates to other organizations, we can think about the potential for not only bottom-up building, but also the potential for the Quad to look at global institutions or things like the Paris Agreement and figure out how it nests within those broad organizations and how it can help to actually implement things that are really coming from the top or the broad levels. I also think that one opportunity that isn't talked about very much is that, the Quad is often pointed out to be a very diverse grouping where the countries don't necessarily agree on everything. But that can also be a strength in the sense that there are a variety of viewpoints and that, if it works well and trust is built, it can be a forum for forging compromises that can be taken to broader forums. So, for example, in a lot of issues we face today, there's a divide between developing and developed countries. And within the Quad, you have those tensions as well. So can they be hammered out? Can they be taken to other forums to help push forward issues that have been blocked for a long time? If so, that would give the Quad, opportunities to really broaden as an organization, not necessarily as the Quad, but to, really push forward the things that it cares about. And I think another opportunity for the Quad is basically the fact that there has been interest from external stakeholders in engaging with it. So again, thinking about my time talking with external actors from around the world, but including within the region, there's been a lot of curiosity and interest in sort of the initiatives and wondering, what they mean and if there can be some sort of a link up between different institutions. So that I think is an opportunity as well. That being said, there are many challenges. I think the biggest one that comes up for a lot of people is internal cohesion. And when we look at the Quad, there has been a pretty clear position by the members of the Quad that they do not want to expand membership because they're more concerned about the cohesion amongst the members and really trying to build that cooperation. And so that's something that will have to be continually addressed and continually updated as the international situation changes. I mean, even many laterals that are small have disagreements, right? They have different priorities, even if they agree on basic issues. So this is something that will continue to come up and comes up in all multilateral and minilateral organizations. I think domestic politics are something that none of us can ignore right now. We have elections coming up in many countries this year. And we've seen the Quad in the past, for example, in Quad 1.0, really suffer from changes in administration and changes in focus. I would say that, at least from my standpoint, it seems unlikely that the Quad will totally go away because there are certain structural reasons that make sense for the four countries to continue cooperating. But it's still, not set in stone where it will go in terms of its agenda or the extent to which it will really have momentum or continue to build. So I also think that the informality of the Quad, which again is shared by many lateral organizations, can limit implementation. I mean, it's just true that there is a certain amount you can do with informal working groups, but at the end of the day, there isn't a secretariat, there isn't a real, huge staff that is taking care of these things. And as the agenda grows, this can be challenging. I also think that, especially on the public goods end, the scale of the problems and the breadth of the agenda is challenging, especially if the Quad decides to keep all of the working groups that it has assigned to itself for now. It's a lot to work on. So, that is something that it will have to think about. Does it want to continue announcing a new initiative or a new working group every year? Because that, will eventually become a limiting factor. And there's also the difficulty of sustaining attention on any of these particular things. Like I said, with health, is this a real priority? Will you invest resources and attention? Because, those are attention and resources that can't be devoted to other things. I think another problem that we could point to is that while the Quad could be a building block, it also could be a stumbling block. So by that, I mean that, if we think about small initiatives, harmonization can be difficult. And as somebody who works on trade as well as security, we've seen this. We've seen that, when countries were frustrated with the WTO, they went to bilateral and minilateral trade agreements. And what we got was this, Asian noodle bowl of trade agreements. And what we figured out was that that was a very messy way to try to facilitate trade, and it was confusing for companies. And then there was a reason that we went back to broader organizations. So right now, Quad agreements and statements are not as complex as trade agreements, so maybe they're not as difficult to harmonize. But if they really keep going forward in these small formats, the principle, I think, is the same, that, you can't really build global consensus if everybody is coming up with separate ideas. There has to be some kind of bridging or harmonization at some point. I also think, as we move to the broader issues, there's definitely going to be continually this tension between inclusion and exclusion that all minilaterals face. Because the problem with minilaterals is really that they exclude far more countries than they include. So there's always going to be this feeling of, countries who are left out and wondering what that means for them. So if we think about Quad countries, they're large countries at the edge of the region, and in the middle of the region lie many, many people who are not included in these discussions that could be shaping them. And that, if you think about it, Hawaii is right there in the middle. So we often hear from people who visit us, particularly from colleagues in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, that they feel like these discussions in the Quad are really geopolitically motivated, that, they appreciate public goods talk, but it may not be the real intention of this grouping. So we even hear from like-minded countries who might want to cooperate that they don't know how to plug into the Quad, or they don't know, where they could really fit in. So I think this is a tension that the grouping will continue to face. Again, it's not unique, but it's present. I think also, as I mentioned at the top, this tension between countering China and providing public goods is something that, will have to be addressed at some point. I think that you can make progress with it, but I'll talk at the end a little bit about the limitations. So to sum up, what does all of this mean kind of beyond the Quad, and how can we think about this era of minilateralism? As I started out at the top, I think that the Quad is really a microcosm of a lot of things that are happening elsewhere. So if you think about all of the opportunities and challenges I just talked about, those are also faced by every other minilateral institution that's trying to facilitate cooperation internally. And if the minilateral institution has taken on a big public goods agenda, then that becomes even more, kind of challenging. So the Quad is having struggles, perhaps, but these are things that are natural and to be expected. The Quad has delivered less than some would like, I would say, but this is also true of most institutions that exist today. So I think it's really a question of, what the standards are and, what one would believe to be a meaningful impact on the region. And so that's something we can perhaps talk about. But, I think that when we look at the Quad, we really are thinking more broadly about, what does this all add up to? What does this era of minilateralism mean? Like, will it produce benefits? If so, for whom? And, what happens to the regional or the international order if we get this explosion of activity in very small formats? My position would be that minilateralism has clear limitations. So basically, you have to leverage other approaches and institutions, particularly if you're trying to provide public goods. Otherwise, it just doesn't really make sense. So at some point, you have to broaden out and you have to move beyond the like-minded, and try to engage with other actors. So to come back as I conclude to the top of the questions I proposed at the top. So can groups like the Quad provide public goods while also serving strategic interests? So I think the key point here, as I was saying, is that these aims are compatible to some extent, but there are also limits. So for the Quad, I think broadening the agenda to include public goods, it really helped it to broaden its appeal, which was useful for the group and I think did achieve its strategic aims. But it can also make goals difficult to balance and deliver because the agenda I showed you with all the working groups is quite broad. That's a lot for a grouping to do in informal working groups and mechanisms. I think internally, the different member countries don't always agree about how to prioritize these different aims. And then externally, other stakeholders are perhaps not necessarily convinced about the group's intentions, though public goods, I would say, are generally welcome when they're provided. So I think there's this sort of pragmatism. I would also say that assessments of the Quad are often quite informed by what the observer thinks the Quad should be doing. So I think that some people really think that the Quad is a security organization and should deliver security, basically. And so they, would like to see the Quad narrow its agenda or go back to maritime security. Whereas for people who really are excited about public goods, leaning into health, trying to do more in long-term non-traditional security issues like climate would really be the way that the organization should go. So I think both in terms of the group's goals and in terms of satisfying external audiences, it's difficult to kind of do both forever. The other question I posed was how can small groups of like-minded countries like the Quad address cross-border problems? And so I think the key point here is that, as I was saying, to really do this, multilateral institutions like the Quad have to build coalitions with broader groups of stakeholders, and they have to build bridges to existing institutions. And I think this is true of all multilateral groupings. And I think this is something that we have not yet seen in this era of multilateralism. So this is kind of the next stage of thinking about what this all means. So as I mentioned, multilateral institutions can be a building block, or they could be a stumbling block. And even if they're not overtly competitive with other multilateral institutions, harmonization and nesting can be difficult. But arguably, if they improve and address problems, even to a limited extent, that is a concrete benefit, a concrete gain for the people who benefit from vaccines or from, climate adaptation or something like that. And if they help to build trust amongst both Quad countries and external partners, then that could be a benefit. So just to conclude, I wanted to have a little bit of reflection on what the implications are for countries who are not members of the Quad. And I certainly welcome, discussion and questions about this. But I do think that it's important to, acknowledge, like I said at the top, that there are competitive tendencies amongst these institutions and, of course, amongst individual countries for attention and influence in the region. But this isn't something new. I mean, this is something we've seen before. And so this is part of the kind of normal negotiation and contestation of the region that we're sort of used to. So the question is sort of how we make sense of it and, how things come out. So even when there isn't competition, though, it can be difficult for external actors to know where to fit in. So whether you like the Quad or not, kind of knowing how this affects you, or even if you do like it and you want to collaborate, how you could plug into a working group is actually not very obvious. And so I think that can be also challenging. And I think as a kind of other challenge, the Quad's geopolitical side is still difficult for some potential partners. And again, being in Hawaii, we do hear a lot of this kind of feedback about the Indo-Pacific strategy, about the Quad, that it really isn't addressing the real needs of the region, and that, there's concern about getting caught up in geopolitics that are really, not going to be beneficial for individual countries. But on the more positive side, I would say that, from my comments and from the examples I showed, there are clearly prospects for consulting, coordinating, and cooperating with the Quad or with parts of the Quad. So I think that it doesn't have to be with the entire Quad. There are also kinds of ways that you can look at what is going on and try to plug into very useful kinds of cooperation and coordination that are going on. I also think that harmonizing or bridging activities can be really productive and can even help to shape some of the directions of these very informal working groups. And I think as a final note, I mean, it's very clear that the Quad has evolved a lot over the last 5 or 6 years, and it will continue to evolve. That's the thing about an informal, flexible structure. There is, quite a lot of capacity for it to adapt. And I think that that presents opportunities because, its future is not necessarily fixed. So as needs in the region change, as it receives input from others in the region, I think there is the opportunity for it to adapt because of this kind of flexibility. So I'll conclude there, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Govella. I now hand over the session to Dr. Gob.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, thank you very much for your very comprehensive, informative, and then the excellent analysis on the evolution of the cloud. And then I particularly like your 3x3 kind of matrix. This saying consultation, coordination, cooperation on the one side, and then the other side is the bilateral, trilateral, and the quad. I think this is a really important, and then this is really the useful matrix to evaluate the achievement of what Quad has been doing. And then I was really I learned a lot about the presentations, and also as well as the reports you published in the past. So before going into the opening the floor for the Q&A, I would like to kind of use my the privilege of the chairpersonship, and then I'd like to ask the 3 quick questions about the quad. Even though like you actually comprehensively touched on the most of the older issues that like the quad faces, I'd like to kind of push a little bit more on the about the membership. So as you said, in order to evolve the quad, you suggested maybe like bridging some of the existing institutions, or including the some of the membership, which could be necessary and important. But then at the same time, there are certain kind of institutional the constraints that like quad faces, because the agenda is very expansive, and you might actually end up kind of facing many kind of mess I mean basically the institutional mess in the functional cooperation. So is it really possible? I mean, like I'm like to ask the if that is possible for Quad to expand the membership, like as many actually say the Quad Plus also. So that's the one question. And then second one is the formalization. You said maybe the informality is pretty flexible in terms of facilitating the cooperation and coordination. But then at the end of the day, there's a certain kind of limitation on that end. So that is there any kind of the quad desire to formalize? I mean, formalize meaning they are setting up some secretariat, so that they can actually streamline the functional cooperation in the quad. So the formalization, the question is one. And then the other thing is the very easy, not easy one, maybe like really difficult one. But then you touched on the domestic politics. If the United States actually have the Trump presidency in this year, I think that Trump might be going to push for the Quad, but then the Quad could be the more kind of strategically oriented rather than functionally oriented. And in that case, do you think the public goods kind of aspect of the Quad is going to dying down? So that's the kind of like 3 questions I'd like to lay out there first. Thank you.
Well, as expected, they're great and very expansive and difficult questions. I think if you ask them to, Quad leaders, they would also be hard pressed to answer. But let me start with the first one was about membership expansion, right? So both actually on membership expansion and formality, it's been very striking that at least in my conversations with people, there is no appetite for member expansion, and there is no appetite for formality amongst Quad countries. But I think that what we tried to look at when we were doing research on this was just that, in fact, in some ways, it's not necessary to think about cooperating with the Quad as such, and it's not necessary to think about Quad expansion. I think that, looking at the structure of things, a better way to think about it is where are there compatibilities and complementarities in cooperation, and where can that be flexibly sort of plugged into, whether it's, continuing. For example, linking up with different working group discussions. Like I remember when we were looking at specifically South Korea, we're like, well, you have a vaccine experts group in the Quad, you have a vaccine experts group in the US ROK, can you link these up? And there's obvious places, right, where you can do that. I think also you could think about the Quad handing issues to different institutions, like broader minilaterals or different kinds of things, right? Like it's not necessarily clear that the Quad has to continue along all these functional lines forever. Like maybe once it reaches a stage, then the cooperation sort of, reaches a permutation of a minilateral or some other forum where they feel like it's now ready. I don't think the Quad has gotten to that point yet. I think it's still very much in the incubator phase. But I think that it's interesting how the idea of Quad Plus really, it doesn't seem to be really like the time for it right now. Because I think within the Quad, as I explained, there is still this consolidation, and I think that the informality of it tends to suggest that this kind of bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral pattern will continue. That it will sort of continue to be fragmented, but in some ways, that's maybe not necessarily a downside. So, but I do think it kind of jars with the ways that we think about, formal cooperation and wanting to engage. So it's not really kind of an ASEAN plus situation, where you have a very institutionalized partner that, has a format and has a setup and then you plug in. So I do think that also has limitations though. So that's kind of where we are. And the second one was
The formality.
formality.
Yeah. So
So I kind of addressed that a little bit, but I do think that right now that's not really a direction that it seems to make sense. But I think that the consolidation of the informal relationships is also a good contribution. So again, you might think about, specific Quad projects that become institutionalized, but I think it's a little bit more fragmented. And then the final question about domestic politics. I mean, I think that is a key question. As I said before, I think that there are a lot of structural factors bringing the four countries together that make it unlikely that the Quad will just disappear. After all, this is an institution that was revived under Trump and continued under Biden, so it seems to have, utility. But I think you're exactly right that the flexible agenda can be molded very easily to emphasize other institutions, and that the framing can be very different. And so I think that also, there is probably a hazard to that kind of inconsistency, to having an institution that's about public goods for a few years and then it's about geopolitical strategy for a few years. And, again, the region I think is full of pragmatic actors, so they wouldn't necessarily, not understand that. But I think it would be, particularly if the public goods elements were just totally dropped, that'd be a problem. But then again, there are informal working groups, so it's always possible that the good people doing the working group activity at the working level would continue on quietly and wait for the day that they can be elevated. So
right, I think that's the probably like the probably the it's the right way to actually institutionalize the Quad. Maybe like the yes, I mean it has the, as you said, like the dual purpose, right? It has the kind of strategic element and also the public goods element, and then I think it is important to pursue the both sides in order to kind of hold the possibility of the further evolution of the Quad, and then not actually trying to probably like the divide the region so clearly. So that's I think like one thing we can think about. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to ask the questions from the floor. If you have any questions, please raise hand, and then I'll just point out. Yes, gentleman there.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. I'm afraid I missed the first 20 minutes or so. If I take a slightly different perspective, one reason for countries, small coalitions of countries to come together for a common purpose is incentives. And how much skin do you have in the game to get to a common purpose? That, as you've hinted, is clearly lacking, aside from one, the perspective of the other superpower. It seems to be lacking coherence in the Quad, and ergo the lack of any concrete action. The elephant in the room to me seems to be, much of it is centered around the region where we are, basically ASEAN. You've got another loose agreement which hasn't gained traction because of the US Congress, and that is IPEF. Just to give the backdrop, if I take members of the Quad, Japan carries more agency and respect in this region as a neutral player, and vastly more than any other. The second is distant. There's one area where there is pressing need for further action, which has existential bearings, is the climate, including the marine economy. You spoke briefly of marine domain awareness, where again, the US has a huge amount of expertise. So the question is, would it make more sense to deal to, if not formally incorporate, I don't think any member of ASEAN would want to, or ASEAN collectively would want to engage directly with Quad. I mean, they have to balance out interests, but bringing in the strengths that we have to bear on a specific set of issues. I mean, the benefits of that is it provides a lot of traction, it gets notice in the neighborhood, and it has a material impact on people's lives. And just to illustrate that, as far as the marine economy or the blue economy, we are in the part of the world which is the most heavily dependent and the most vulnerable. So I'm wondering if you care to share your thoughts on that.
So your question is the listen. Yeah.
Oculus, for instance,
Okay.
years in back, the Quad itself.
So can the Quad have the more clear objectives? Okay. All right. What can the Quad do? Okay. All right.
Right. So, I mean, I think that the first part of your comments about kind of skin in the game and incentives is kind of what I was referring to in this kind of dilemma between the strategic aims and the public goods, right? So in a lot of the minilaterals like AUKUS, there is a strategic purpose, and that's what is being pursued. And there is not, I mean, there may be sort of framing as public goods in some ways, but, you know, it's clear it exists for a strategic purpose. And the Quad is kind of trying to have it both ways, right? And so I think that there is, you know, less kind of a clear benefit in providing public goods for the individual countries than if they had a more narrowly focused strategic interest. I think that the second part of your comment about is very well taken about these other arrangements and issue areas. I mean, I think there are benefits. I think there are ways that if countries are willing to engage with the Quad, you know, it needs to be sort of explained and made clear how Quad aims can better align with, say, ASEAN initiatives around connectivity or different kinds of things. You know, the development focus that, you know, is more important to countries in the region could be explained more clearly. I think that, you know, these things, it is an evolving group. There are a lot of projects. I'm sure there is somewhere where this can be plugged into. And again, it may not be productive for it to be a so-called Quad, you know, kind of collaboration, but it could involve the countries of the US, Australia, India, and Japan, you know, collaborating with ASEAN. And I think that at the end of the day, if it provides benefits, then I would say that's a plus, you know, for the region, if it helps and, you know, if it can be facilitated. But I think that there's so much good work being done by other organizations that there should be clear areas. You know, these are difficult problems, and the more actors that we can get engaged, the better, I think, for a lot of them.
Thank you very much. So the Constantino, and then later Sharon. So Constantino first.
Thank you. And great, Christy. I think we all think we know the Quad, at least I think. And it's just amazing to see what you brought to tell us that there's so much more to the Quad, the evolution, the many supply chains of the Quad towards the region. Three very quick questions, just things that have always puzzled me, and sort of your lecture activated again in me, revived. One is, you know, to what point do you see if public goods, as in your original definitions, are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, right? Those are two definitions in economics terms, at least. To what extent can you have a public good in Asia that excludes or China, right? And takes it out of the equation. That is a perception or not, but it seems to me that China is not part of it, is not being plugged into it. So is it really a public good, what the Quad is delivering, at least for those definitions? The second question is, if this is a public good, it probably matters very much what you discussed in your last part, which is what does the public need? What does the public want? What does the public require? So more than expanding, etc., what mechanisms do you see for the Quad to develop more skill in terms of being in listening mode and engaging countries in this region to understand what they really want and need. Maybe it's there already, but if you could, throw some more light on the existing mechanisms or whether that matters or not, because it's again something I hear a lot in the region that we'd like to be more involved, like you point out, right? And we'd like to sort of shape the agenda of the priority areas. The last one is a curiosity I've always had, and I think hopefully you can, is that what explains the transition from Quad 2 to Quad 3? The casting of Quad 2 in 2017 was clearly a security, military-oriented Quad. I remember being in Delhi, the Raisina dialogue, and we had the 4 Navy chiefs as one of the first sort of physical appearances of the Quad at that dialogue in Delhi. So we shouldn't be surprised if from 17 to 20, the immediate reaction across the region was, this is a security balancing instrument to contain China. All those signals were apparent. Now, it seems there's been a pivot post-21. What explains that? And is it too late, maybe? Is the stigma of the security context of the Quad still sticking to the Quad? At least that's at least my sense sometimes in the region. Thank you.
Again, a good set of 3 questions. So I think the first point about public goods is excellent. And I think that the reason I didn't introduce a definition at the beginning is because I think the things that are discussed as public goods, or my other kind of pet peeve sometimes is global commons, are not really as such. So I think the first 2 things I gave examples about, health and climate change, like those are things that are public goods in the sense that they are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, in the sense that if you provide it, you can't exclude others. And one entity's enjoyment of it does not diminish from another. But I think that in other issues like technology, I was basically making the point that to some extent, you could frame this as public goods, but if the goal is to, for example, lessen the market share of Chinese companies, then obviously that is a rivalrous sort of endeavor, right? So I think that sometimes it's not entirely clear what the lines are, and so I think that there are some areas of public goods provision that I think are more straightforward, and others that are potentially could be public goods, but also have this dual purpose. So then the second question about how we go into listening mode, I think that the efforts of the Quad to engage more with non-state actors and kind of more grassroots efforts is basically going to help this. So, although things like, the Investors Network or the fellowships, don't get as much attention necessarily, if the Quad really wants to engage, those are the kinds of bottom-up voices, bottom-up connections that it needs. And it also needs to, be in listening mode when all of the countries are, talking with interlocutors. So there are many points of entry, but then I guess the question is, what input gets taken up and how does it get elevated? And that, as we know, is, a highly political process. But I think that if the Quad wants to continue along this line of thinking about itself and what it can provide with the region, then considering what the region really wants and needs is essential, right? It's not just what the Quad feels like providing, it's what the region needs, and that genuine connection is important. Maybe the Quad doesn't pursue that along all the working group lines. Maybe there are just 2 working groups that are really public goods working groups, and they really try to do that, and they sort of have their strategic aims in others. That's also possible. For your last question about the shift from Quad 2.0 to 3.0, I think in some sense it was a realization that competition with China takes many forms. So in the Trump administration, there was this focus on security competition, security threats. And I think by the time we get, into 2021 and the COVID-19 pandemic, it starts to be about soft power. It starts to be about other kinds of influences, and it starts to be about who is providing benefits, And so I think that in some ways there's a lot of continuity across the 2, but it's a recognition, which I think you've seen in the US too, right? That it's, it's not just about military, it's about so-called integrated deterrence and using all of the tools across the entire scope of government. So economic, soft power, intellectual exchange. And so I think that, the reframing, I do think is beneficial. It can produce benefits, but I do think it was somewhat consistent with this idea that, there's something happening in the region that these countries needed to respond to, and that, in fact, the kind of more pointed Quad 2.0 approach was not going to get them there. right? And so why not? I mean, there's a lot, again, among the Quad countries in terms of potential values or interests that, can have this public goods angle. So I think it was like, how do we use this for good? How do we kind of project this? So just a quick thought on that.
Yeah, framing is actually really important. I think the Quad still actually the four countries still are engaging in the military cooperation, right? Like through the Malabar other joint military exercise and naval exercise too. So I think that's the framing is also very important. So we could actually extend our session until the 4:30. So if you have any question, then please be prepared. And then but first, like I'd like to ask Sharon. Do you actually there is
Hi, I'm Sharon. I'm from the ASEAN Studies Center at the ISAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Thank you very much for sharing your views. I too thought I knew the Quad, but you gave so much more details. Just to offer 2 points. One, to Constantine's question of how did the Quad move from 2.0 to 3.0? Maybe a hypothesis I have is that because during the time of 2017 to 2018, there was a time when ASEAN started to think about its AOIP, the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And then in 2019, they came up with a document. Well, ASEAN has been slow, and none of the countries in the region actually have an Indo-Pacific strategy or even embrace the idea of an Indo-Pacific. And in the meantime, we've seen in the intervening years, there were many Indo-Pacific strategies that's, being articulated across the world about this region, and yet this region itself doesn't have a conception of the Indo-Pacific. So when Indonesia came out with the AOIP, which has been criticized actually by many observers that it's not theoretical enough, it doesn't come up with a grand idea about the Indo-Pacific, but rather it's very functional. And in a way, it aligns as the Quad changed and evolved into a more functional grouping, and with the AOIP being itself very functional with the different mainstreaming of the areas of cooperation, it sort of broadens that space for ASEAN and the Quad to think about talking to each other. I won't say cooperating, but even talking to each other. So maybe that's one reason. The second one is a question from me. The Quad has shied away from economic cooperation, has not been talking about bringing the real goods, not public goods, but the goods in terms of, benefiting economies. 2 members of the Quad is not part of any of the regional trade agreements that ASEAN is in, the RCEP and the CPTPP. 2 members are. And on the other hand, in terms of bilateral FTAs with ASEAN, 3 members have FTAs with ASEAN, 1 member doesn't have. So obviously, ASEAN is very keen to engage with India, with the US. Is there any way that the Quad can think about economic engagement, not in the conventional signing of a Quad FTA or regional trade pact, but really maybe functionally in trade facilitation, in investment facilitation? Is that an area that can be considered? Because really the way through to ASEAN's heart is through its stomach. And really it's about giving that economic goods to ASEAN. Thanks.
Just on your first point, I mean, I agree. I think in my presentation, I actually said there were 2 reasons, and one was responding to China, and the other was the viewpoints of ASEAN and other countries. So I think I may have framed it as sort of complaints, but I do also think that it's, the evolution of thought in the region. And that was, of course, those documents and those discussions were watched by Quad countries very closely. It had become much more obvious by 2021, what the mood was in the region. And of course, the Biden administration was more sensitive to that than the Trump administration would have been. So I think it is, it is both things. On your point about trade, I work on trade. So yes, that would be great if the Quad did that. But I think that the real problem is that, the US and India, the domestic politics of trade is just so difficult that, even in a small format, even just on their own, it's very prohibitively politically difficult to engage. I think that trade facilitation is a great area. I think there's a lot of ways you can reduce the frictions of trade without talking about kind of market access. But I think that's basically what IPEF is trying to do. So I mean, maybe not, but I think that's where the action has moved essentially. So I think that it would be difficult and perhaps, a non-starter for the Quad with the political barriers of the members to take that up. And so I think especially in an era where they're focused on kind of trying to deliver, I think they would feel like it was setting themselves up for a hurdle that was perhaps too high. And so I think that that's difficult. The closest they get are things like supply chain resilience and this kind of economic security cooperation, which I always comment feels like it has replaced trade engagement for the US. It's like economic security as opposed to fill that gap. But I totally agree that it doesn't, and that without the trade pillar, it's a much weaker sort of engagement with the region, and it feels like it's lacking. So I 100% agree, but I don't think that the Quad is necessarily the venue to take that on, or that it would help with its agenda problems right now. So, but point well taken.
Right, thank you very much. So yes, Yulin.
Thank you so much for your sharing just now. So just now you did mention about critical and emerging technology being one of the areas of initiative that the Quad is going to address. And because I'm doing a research on the Pacific Islands, so we all know that the Pacific Islands are very, very not tech developed. So where and that, like you also said that the Quad's initiative also nests in like other institutions. So where does PIF lie in that sense? Yeah, thank you.
So where does the Pacific Islands Forum fit into these discussions? So I think that there are lots of opportunities. I mean, I think that it's interesting how in the last couple of years, the attention of the US in particular has turned so strongly towards the Pacific Islands. And there's this attempt to basically make up for years and decades of neglect of that region and to engage on a lot of issues. I think most of the attention has been focused more on the climate change infrastructure end, but certainly technology provision. We did a project with my center in Hawaii on undersea cables, which are a huge, basically critical infrastructure of connectivity in the region. When you look at Pacific Islands countries, how can you develop when you are so limited in so many ways? So I think that in these kinds of critical infrastructure, and the other kinds of connectivity things, these are things that can really make a very big difference to countries. So I think that, we've seen the attention of the Quad increasingly go to the Pacific, again, for strategic reasons, but there's a lot of good that can be done through these kinds of initiatives. I think some low-lying fruit that is not necessarily that expensive either. So a lot of potential. But again, they need to listen to the needs of the region and try to maintain that engagement because it can't be a sort of one-off.
Great, thank you very much. Others? Okay, Descartes.
Great. Thank you so much, Chrissy, for that. Just to broaden the discussion a little bit. I mean, living in Singapore, in Asia, I'm always struck by the fact that the idea of the Quad is much more powerful, much more attractive than what it does, what its agenda is, and what its outcomes are. Why do you think that is? What is it about the Quad that makes us all sit up and look at what's happening? Whether it's the leader level summits that have been happening the last few years, it always pops up in some of these regional security dialogues, whether it's Raisina, Shangri-La. Others are talking about how they can involve themselves with the Quad, South Korea, Europe, the UK. What is it about the idea of the Quad that makes it attractive?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think to some extent, as with all new things, before the Quad is fully formed, it can be all things to all people, and there's kind of this hope for what it can achieve. But I mean, I think part of it really is, the exciting combination of countries that it brings together and this idea that, there is some kind of synergy and capacity that could be different than what we see in other groupings, right? Because of the differences and the diversity, which make it challenging, but also make it, makes you wonder, like, what could come of this? And if something did, wouldn't that be potentially a game changer? So I think people watch it for that. But I think that also there are a lot of difficulties inherent with achieving this. So I think that, as with many newer ideas, I think the Quad at this moment, I think Kay has also written about this in his work, but, you can kind of, continue on with ambiguity about what your goals are. And, people can hope that there will be this realization. And so I think that with all of these institutions, there has been that kind of excitement, I think, at various points about what lies ahead and what they could bring. So in that sense, I think it is exciting. It's, a potential new frontier of cooperation, but I think it also is laden with a lot of inherent challenges.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is almost the close to the end, or the almost end. I actually wanted to ask the one quick question, but probably like I'm just gonna ask you the coffee session or something. All right, okay. Thank you very much for the great questions and then also comments, and then thank you very much for your excellent keynote speech. Please let's have our hands with the Chris C. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Govella and Dr. Koga, for this really insightful and substantial session. We will now move into a 15-minute tea and coffee break, and refreshments are being served outside. And we'll reconvene in another 10-15 minutes for the panel discussion. 10 minutes. I've received new instructions, yes. Welcome back, everyone. We will now commence with the panel discussion on climate diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. I would like to invite the panelists to please join us on stage. Ms. Sharon C., Senior Fellow and Coordinator at the ASEAN Studies Center and Climate Change in Southeast Asia Program at the ISAS Yusof Ishaq Institute. Ms. Nagisa Shiba, Policy Researcher, Adaptation and Water Unit at the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies, Japan. And Dr. Constantino Xavier, Fellow, Foreign Policy and Security Studies at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in India. The session will be chaired by Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS. Would you please join on stage? I will now hand over the session to Dr. Karthik.
Great. Thank you so much. Welcome back. I hope you had a good coffee break. So in this session, we're going to just kind of delve into one specific issue that's becoming a topic of a lot of regional discussions, a lot of minilateral discussions, and bilateral and trilateral as well. There'll be a strong, it's great that the context was laid to kind of understand what the kind of strategic context that we're dealing with, which affects and influences the kind of issues that countries are discussing, negotiating, including climate change. And so what we're going to drill into here is talk a little bit more about the different kinds of arrangements that some of the key Asian countries are engaging on, specifically on climate, bilateral, minilateral, trilateral, and multilateral, why they are engaging in these kinds of discussions on climate change within these specific and emergent arrangements. How does it fit into their interests, and what they hope to achieve by engaging on climate strategically through these diplomatic discussions that are evolving over the last few years in the Indo-Pacific. So before we start and before we kind of get into what some of these key countries are doing, let's just maybe set the table on what climate diplomacy is. And that's something that we keep hearing about a lot, especially now. And so let me just maybe speak broadly about what it is. So, I mean, we've all been experiencing the effects of climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, temperatures, but they're also causing a lot of different kinds of harmful events, and countries are dealing with the effects of climate, right? I think the repercussions of climate not only threaten people's livelihoods and impair development, but they also affect geopolitics in the region. And they raise important geopolitical questions that touch upon sovereignty, they touch upon multilateralism, they touch upon development. And so it involves countries figuring out how they can work together increasingly on climate. But climate is also increasingly becoming strategic, right? Countries are using climate and domestic climate action to advance their own interests. It's becoming a part of their foreign policy toolkit, right? And so why are they doing that, and what are the implications of that for regional order and also for international order? I think finally, climate diplomacy is proactive diplomacy, but it's also preventive diplomacy, right? So how countries, not just in Asia, but globally, are stitching together new forms of cooperation, consultation on climate to advance their own mitigation and adaptation strategies. So what we're going to do today is talk deeply about what key Asian countries, specifically in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, India and Japan, are doing on climate diplomatically. Is climate a foreign policy issue for them? How is it becoming an important strategic issue? And then we'll dig deeper into the climate transitions in each of these countries and how that's affecting how they negotiate on climate with one another. We'll also talk a little bit about climate finance, since it's becoming a very critical issue, both multilaterally and also in regional and multilateral discussions. And also end with some understanding or some takes on how the geopolitics of the region, how the contentious, the fractious geopolitics of the region is affecting climate change and climate diplomacy going forward. So I'm going to, and my colleague side has already introduced the panelists, so I'm not going to do that. And so let me just start, and we are in Southeast Asia, so I'm going to start with Sharon. And just maybe, so just get some initial comments on what ASEAN is doing on climate, what the interests of ASEAN countries are on climate, and whether how it's evolved over the years. So over to you.
Thanks, Karthik. And thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think you all know, well, ASEAN is really a price taker on climate. It's not a leader. It's got to really follow what has been globally set. But ASEAN countries are dutiful global citizens. They've all submitted their updated NDCs. 4 of them have submitted their long-term low-emission development strategies. All of them have pledged to reach net zero by 2050 or at the latest 2060, and that's Indonesia. But I guess that's not the full picture. Unfortunately, ASEAN does not have a single unified ASEAN-wide mitigation target. Neither does it have a holistic climate adaptation plan. It has an ASEAN regional plan of action for adaptation to drought, strangely, but not to floods, which is what we've experienced in the last few years, and not to sea level rise or heat, which as you all know, we are all experiencing that right now. So within ASEAN, what happens is different sectorals come up with their own adaptation and mitigation strategies. And sometimes not all of the strategies talk to each other. So the ASEAN State of Climate Change report has given some recommendations for adaptation and mitigation, but more work has to be done to kind of break down the silos that ASEAN work within and to look at more cross-sectoral coordination. And they definitely need to elevate some of the more immediate climate issues to the highest levels. And by that, I mean to the summit level, and to find ways to cooperate and enhance the region's climate resilience. And on this point, I think what the Quad is doing on climate change partnerships is definitely a public good that's welcomed by ASEAN. And in a way, it's a good that comes with no strings attached. And that's very much welcomed by the region. At the domestic level, every country has its own climate policies and plans that's contextualized to its own unique circumstances. But domestic climate policies across the region are still weak and definitely not designed to help countries reach net zero. So if you go on to Climate Action Tracker, for instance, it assesses 7 out of 10 ASEAN countries. Everyone is severely insufficient in their plans to meet the goal of limiting temperature increase to 1.5 or 2 degrees. So what are the problems? I think the major problem is there's the absence of political will in the region. We don't see climate as a major campaign issue. For instance, in past elections last year, where we had, the Philippines elections, the Thai elections, even in the most recent February Indonesia elections, and we won't be seeing it soon. So For instance, in the Indonesian elections, the vice president candidate Gibran, who is the son of Jokowi, was very careful on the campaign trail to say that, you know, the government should not burden the public and the poor with expensive R&D and transition costs related to climate change. The second issue is different competing interests are at work. So on the one hand, Indonesia desperately needs to decarbonize by increasing renewable energy capacity. But on the other hand, it has also decided to trim its own RE targets from 23% of its total energy mix in 2025 to about 17 to 19%. So in that sense, it's backsliding. Indonesia also planned to implement a carbon tax in 2022, but this has been delayed to 2026. So I think within all of these developments, you see that there are different competing interests between different agencies, and not dealing with the cross-cutting nature of climate issues is actually very counterproductive at the domestic level as well as at the regional level. And it makes for poor climate governance in general. But I can't stop here and say that ASEAN hasn't done anything. In terms of progress, ASEAN definitely has done some things. For instance, the finance sector has laid the groundwork with an ASEAN taxonomy on sustainable finance, which is still voluntary at this stage. But it has prompted countries in the region to develop their own national taxonomies to be interoperable with ASEAN's taxonomy. So, you know, in this regard, I think as we see more and more countries come up with their own national taxonomies that work in line with the ASEAN one, hopefully other regions will also develop their own taxonomies and in time to come kind of stitch together a wider taxonomy that can change from being voluntary to mandatory. The second one is ASEAN is really working towards operationalizing the ASEAN power grid with renewable sources. And I think you've seen in last year's summit where the leaders actually talked about operationalizing this at the highest level. And really why? Because the very first Pathfinder project involving Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore actually commenced multilateral power trade in June 2022. And that has, you know, led countries to start conceiving of the idea of, no, we can possibly do this. We've talked about this for 3 decades about a power grid. And finally, we're seeing something happening on a multilateral basis. And that's also sparked off another sub-regional grouping, the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines sub-regional group, to think about their own power integration project as well. So in time to come, you know, and with assistance from dialogue partners, ASEAN's dialogue partners, maybe we can really move towards, you know, mitigating climate change with the use of renewable energy. You asked me about questions about climate interests and how they affect and engage with climate diplomacy. I think right now in ASEAN, climate is still not a foreign policy issue in the way that trade, economic security, and energy securities are, and definitely not in the leaders' talking points, right, as we see. But because of the fragmentation of multilateral institutions, we are beginning to see an emergence of this kind of talk where, you know, climate security might creep into the agenda and make its way up there.
Just briefly, Sharon, before I pass the floor to Nagisa, your institute, you publish as you mentioned, a climate outlook every year, which is a survey of regional climate attitudes in ASEAN. Could you maybe share briefly on the findings of the outlook and the public perceptions of climate here?
So we do a survey on the public's perceptions and attitudes towards climate change across the 10 ASEAN countries. And we've done that for 4 years. So this year will be the 5th year. And what's really interesting is that the first year when we started the survey and we asked the public about NDCs, and clearly there was a mistake because not everyone knew what NDC stood for. They knew what climate pledges were. Then the second year we changed that and we asked them, and they were disappointed actually with the way their countries had formed the NDC. And it showed us that actually countries who had not undertaken enough consultation with the public. The second point that came up through the 4 years of the survey is that they actually believe that no pain, no gain, you know. When we asked them who should bear the greatest costs, you know, the countries believe, participants believe that the government should pick up the biggest costs. And when we ask questions like, what about carbon tax? Would you be open to accepting a carbon tax? And actually, to our surprise, the public understands that the political economy has to change in order to support decarbonization, and they're willing to take a shot at it. So respondents from Vietnam, Indonesia, and Philippines, for instance, are the most supportive of a carbon tax. But ironically, the country that has actually implemented a carbon tax is the most unsupportive, and that's Singapore. And again, when we ask them questions about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, over 51% of the region say that, yes, we should be phasing it out, with the greatest support coming from Vietnam, Singapore, and Thailand. Whereas Brunei was not very sure about that. And the findings have been quite consistent over the years.
Thank you, Sharon. Nagisa, Japan. Japan's a leader on climate. It has its green growth strategy. It's engaged across a litany of different arrangements, both multilateral, bilateral, trilateral. It's a leader within the G7, also in the G20 on climate. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I want to show my great appreciation to the organizers. Thanks for inviting me to this excellent panel. So the climate diplomacy is really interesting topic. And in discussing climate diplomacy, I want to highlight the two aspects of climate change as an issue. In one aspect, climate change is the global agenda, obviously, that requires multilateral effort. So the country have to show their proactive attitude to solve this problem as a global agenda. So, for example, Japan is one of the biggest emission countries. So they have to show that they are making a great effort to contribute to solve this problem. So such as the net zero by 2050. So yeah, that's why the Japan has taken a proactive roles in the climate negotiation and the international cooperation in the area of climate change. This is also linked with the involvement of all the countries in the global collective effort. So that's why the Japan encourages all the countries to contribute to the climate change agendas. So that's one aspect. And in second aspect, which is intertwined in with the first point, the climate change is seen as a security issue. So climate change itself is posing a security threat, such as energy security, water and food security. It intensifies the disaster risks. So that's why the climate change has been integrating into the following policy agendas. And this is something that the Japan has been highlighted as well, because the revised national security strategy of Japanese government, which was published last year, emphasized the climate change issues quite a lot. It's related to the energy security and ensuring the resources to achieve net zero, as well as the regional cooperation on adaptation and resilience buildings. So I think the other major countries also include the climate change aspect into their security policy documents. This is a really interesting topic to discuss. And also the countries try to use the climate actions as a diplomatic tools as well. So for example, the Quad initiative, as Christy mentioned, the Quad published the Q-Charm, which is the assistance package for the mitigation and adaptation effort. So this is one example. And also the Japan tried to expand its security ties with ASEAN countries by promoting the zero emission actions, which is represented by the ASEC, ASEAN Zero Emission Community Initiative. So ASEAN is really important partner for Japan to secure their energy, as well as the critical mineral supplies. And also for ASEAN, Japan is also critical partners, given the change in the geopolitical situation. So yeah, that's why the climate diplomacy has the different kinds of aspect, and for Japan, it's really getting critical topics to address. So yeah, that is my initial take on about your question.
Great. Thank you so much. Tino, India historically has been regarded as a not a very confident or proactive climate actor, but that's changed over the years. Why has that changed, and what is India doing on climate internationally these days?
Thanks, Kartik and ISAS for having me here. Really, really great chance to discuss across regions and countries different comparative climate policies. Kartik, I'm remembering, I traditionally don't work much on climate. In fact, your own book has a wonderful chapter on that old India that was reluctant about climate, about the Rio summit in '92, and you map, the ecosystem in India, domestic and international, how the norms changed in India. I didn't work much on climate before. I remember I started working on climate because in the report and the research that Kartik and I thought of doing together, you at one point said, Tino, foreign policy is climate, climate is foreign policy. And I thought it was a very simplistic, but also very elegant way to explain what we're dealing with. You look at rare earths and critical minerals today. You look at trade and the fiscal policies of countries today. You look at the loss and damage fund at COP and the negotiations. They're all in the context of geopolitical competition, different interests, different foreign policy interests, just the critical minerals. Where do you buy mines? How do you mine? How do you acquire rare earths? How do you process them? How do you adapt them for your private sector interests in terms of your supply chains? So we may not be very interested in geopolitics sometimes, but whether trade or climate experts, but geopolitics is extremely interested in what's happening in the climate space. And that intertwining will follow. And I think India has read that situation quite well. So first point is we see a very different India from the one that you mapped in '92. It is an India that is much more proactive. We saw the Prime Minister of India now announcing his interest in hosting the COP summit in 2028 in New Delhi. We see an India that has developed new climate institutions, the International Solar Alliance, for example, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. We see an India that is comfortable talking about climate in the Quad, in one or maybe even two of the working groups that are sort of climate focused, not only on climate change, but also on, again, rare earths and critical minerals. So yes, Kartik, we see an India that's sort of much more proactive, positive, productive, if you want, on climate engagements abroad, rather than a more reluctant, development-centric India that we had in the past. And explaining this, I think we see two very basic explanations. I would caution against them. You will see a lot of people saying, well, this is just a lot of posturing from India. It is all about reputation and India wanting to assume some type of leadership of the global south, of developing countries, or more visibility. I'm a bit skeptical because I think states generally want more than reputation. Of course, that's very important for India, that reputation, but I think we should dig a little deeper. The second slightly lazy explanation on India's proactive climate diplomacy is that this is all for domestic posturing, that this allows the government to sell India as a leader abroad at home for electoral purposes, to gain political capital at home. Interesting about domestic politics, we talked on the Quad, that always affecting foreign policies. But I think, again, that is not special to India. It happens in all countries, and it can't be driving what is a more proactive climate policy, right? It's not about politics. It's not necessarily about geopolitics. And I think the three main reasons I can sort of think of that signify or represent some sort of consolidated policy interests within the Indian state and civil society, but particularly within the Indian government, is first, there's a clear understanding that India will not be able to grow without going partially, fully, we can discuss, green. So to attract foreign direct investment, to intensify your trade interdependence with the rest of the world, you will have to develop a green transition trajectory, right? As a still lower middle income country, to attract capital from abroad, to deliver on the growth story at home for a country of 1.3 billion people, that is, an economy that is, I think, just growing at 8%. We saw the most recent figures. You will have to go green. Second reason is innovation, technology, and upgrading of the economy in that sense. The green growth trajectory of India for the next few decades is seen as an opportunity for India to also innovate in terms of science, technology, manufacturing, and becoming finally sort of a trade hub in Asia. And that requires, again, a climate element and partnerships abroad. The third and final reason why I see this climate policy becoming a bit more proactive from India is the idea that this is not really only about climate. This is about sustainable growth in the larger perspective. So when you see India announcing the LIFE initiative, the Prime Minister Modi announced, it is about a longer term quality of growth that India wants, which has a climate element, but is not necessarily climate centric and focused. And I think that's maybe the distinction I could say between a Swedish climate diplomacy and an Indian climate diplomacy. I guess in the Swedish climate diplomacy, growth and sustainable growth has to be climate centric and very focused on the climate transition. In India, climate is one part of a larger developmental ambition over the next few decades.
Thanks, Tito. I want to just that's a good segue to talk about what the relevance of COPs are today. And I want to start with India there, because India still negotiates through the COP. It has considerable faith in the COP to set targets, not just for itself, but a lot of the developed countries out there. But a lot of its climate action and climate diplomacy has branched out. It's the G20, as you mentioned, so the LIFE initiative is a big part of it. The International Solar Alliance, which India shepherded, and it's now internationalizing across the rest of the world. What role do COPs still play in India's climate diplomacy? And how has its climate action shifted from COPs to some of the other arrangements today?
By the way, just remembering one on the last point on why this is also policy. I mean, over 40% of India's employment is in agriculture sector, right? So you will need to have a climate diplomacy to accelerate transition if you want to have a political economy at home that is sustainable and which is beginning to become seriously affected by climate disasters, etc. So it's not that it's the government is proactive. Some of the domestic interests are very interested in accelerating that. I think, Kartik, the question of COP or not is a bit of a fake one. I think we've battled through finally, I think us in scholarship to tell, frankly, decision makers and some orthodox thinking that the era of global governance regimes, I'm thinking of WTO, for example, these days on trade, but similar on COP in climate that's now 30 years old, is becoming outdated or lesser marginal utility for governments to invest in. And therefore, that doesn't mean that you have to choose. It doesn't mean, I think, that it's fair to say that India is undermining the COP or disinterested in it. I think India has taken a stance that we see clearly manifested in the report we did, for example, at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in Delhi Tracks to Transition, that there is a attempt to build around the COP to strengthen and complement the COP. So in our work, I think we came across a variety of initiatives where India is taking unusually proactive initiative in developing new frameworks for cooperation at the global level, at the minilateral or plurilateral level, at the bilateral level, and also sort of what we call the triangular north-south cooperation. So across these four levels, you have innovation happening to insert climate into new frameworks. So it's a tailoring of climate diplomacy in different sectors. Could be solar and renewable energies, could be a finance and mitigation, can be adaptation. So that's why, for example, at the global level, we see India still working actively at the COP, but also working through other global institutions, whether it's the global GCF or GEF, for example. We see India comfortable discussing climate and climate finance at the IMF and the banking systems, for example, and coordinate on that. We see India at the minilateral level developing the International Solar Alliance, the Climate Disaster Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and joining the International Energy Agency, for example, which is in the making, becoming the first global South or developing country to join the Mineral Security Partnership, that is mostly OECD Global North, exclusively OECD countries, except for India now. So you see that happening at the minilateral level. The triangular one means, and India is positioning itself, you may have seen this during the G20 presidency, as a hub to develop affordable, scalable climate solutions for the global South. So attracting global North, US, Europe, Japan, finance, tech, scaling it up for solutions that are global South centric, and then re-export them for countries that are being affected by climate in Africa and the global South. And finally, the series of bilateral climate partnerships that India has been engaging, whether with the European Union, whether with different European Union member states at the same time, with the US, with Japan, etc. Now, this is a bit of a jungle of acronyms, institutions, and activities. I think the point we discussed earlier today also about the Quad as one piece of that begs the question of priorities, of whether the various parts of this Indian climate diplomacy add up to the old whole that the COP was. And these are questions now I think that need a bit of further assessment and thinking.
Nagisa, Japan has placed considerable faith in the international climate regime, with the UN FCCC and COPs. It's been a leader through the Kyoto Protocol ever since. Has its attitudes toward the COP changed over time as it's engaging more strategically on climate through the G7, with the ASEAN and other kinds of actors?
Thank you so much for your questions. Yeah, the attitude to the COP has been changing over time. Yes, I will say so. Because yeah, this is a kind of my impression by participating in the COP as the government delegates and as well as the observer over the past 10 years. The UN FCCC COP is, of course, it's really important platform to create the commitment and keep a momentum for climate actions, but also it's tend to end up with the divide between North and South, or developed country and developing country, or I would say dichotomy. So that's why going beyond the COP is getting really important for many countries to achieve the climate neutrality, and that's why the Japan has been expanding their policies even outside of the UN FCCC. For example, in Japan's climate interest, green transformation, or GX, has been really important. So they try to achieve both the decarbonization and the economic growth over the next decades. So that's why they try to strengthen their partnership with G7 or ASEAN in terms of promoting the GX as the policy policy approach. So this is the one aspect, and also I will say the COP discussion is likely to trapped by the kind of the discussion on the finance, because due to the common but differentiated responsibility principle, or the divide between North and South, the discussion is easily getting stuck in the middle. And this kind of situation has not been changing over the last 30 years. So yeah, that's why the country have to, like Japan, have to show that they are fulfilling the global commitment, but not only by providing the finance support, but also by providing or taking an initiative on the climate action concrete climate action, because the Paris Agreement is now shifting from the rule-making phase to the implementation phase. And what I found interesting was at COP28, the Japanese government published the assistance package for the implementation of Paris Agreement, and they highlighted 3 gaps. One gap is ambition gap. So the ambition for the mitigation of climate change is not enough at this point. So it's not sufficient in order to reach the 1.5 degree targets. So that is the gap highlighted in their assistance package. And the second gap is adaptation gap. So adaptation is also the critical pillar of the Paris Agreement, but the kind of the gap of the implementation of adaptation action is also lacking. So this is another point should be taken by the global collective effort. And the last gap is the implementation gap, as I mentioned. So yeah, that's why the kind of implementation gaps should be fulfilled by the effort, not only by the Japanese government, but also the regional partners. So yeah, this is something that I wanted to highlight in terms of the COP engagement of Japanese government.
Sharon, I wanted to introduce the concept of JETPs in this context, just energy transitions. Few countries in Southeast Asia are increasingly interested in that, Vietnam and Indonesia, hoping to get financing through these new forms of public cooperation, international cooperation. What does that say about how Southeast Asia is thinking about using and leveraging different kinds of international climate partnerships to advance its own transition?
I think, as I said before at the start, that Southeast Asia is a price taker. So any kind of cooperation initiatives that come our way, we will take it. On the JET piece, I think there's been a bit of a delay because the JET piece have certain high demands that may have affected the countries. And here again is a very clear example of the different agencies within a country that are discussing, and kind of there are push and pull forces at play here when you're talking about certain provisions in JETP, and when you're thinking about how you're going to fulfill those obligations. That's why it's causing a bit of a delay right now, especially in Indonesia. I think having a bit of a rethink about the JETP. But be that as it may, I think climate, transition finance is very important for the region, largely because in the region, I think we have the youngest fleet of coal-fired power plants. We are also about not the largest emitter in the world, but certainly contributing quite a significant percentage. I think about 9.8% from the region. And of the 9.8%, majority of it is from Indonesia. So it definitely makes sense to go for, if Indonesia were to move the needle just that little bit, there will be already a change there. But what does this tell us? I think what it tells us is that, the global governance regime, which has served us very well, and its multilateral institutions, may no longer be fit for purpose. And in the sense that, because it's not fit for purpose, countries are now looking around. And I think Nagisa said, about there are groupings that come out, around the COP that works to support an increase in climate ambition. And all of that is good. But it's also an indicator that because the regime cannot move forward as a unified whole, right? That's why countries go around looking for other avenues. It may not be a bad thing, because it's just a reflection of the times that we live in, that we have so many competing interests and geopolitical tensions and so on. And the COP, every year that the COP meets, right? Climate injustice and all these issues, it always ends up hijacking the entire COP discussion. And I agree with you that, it's beyond rulemaking now. It's time to move into the implementation. And that's where initiatives like the JETP is important because it helps countries to begin to implement some of their plans with assistance.
You mentioned in your earlier comments about ASEAN's dialogue partners. Which dialogue partners are most critical for climate for ASEAN?
Diplomatically, I have to say every dialogue partner is important for ASEAN. But I would say some of the most interested and active dialogue partners would be Japan for the region. And Japan has done a lot of outreach to the region on climate issues. But some of these policies and plans that Japan has, in a way, it betrays actually what of Japan's industrial policy, which is still very much, based back in the 1990s and the early 2000s, right? Meeting also Japan's own energy needs and other supply chain needs. So, but Japan has extended this hand to ASEAN to ask ASEAN to co-create a vision together. And this was last year at the 50th anniversary. So I think a lot more discussion and dialogue needs to happen between ASEAN and Japan, to decide on a direction together.
Nagisa, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon, for giving a really interesting insight. And yeah, I think as I mentioned, Japan is also seeing the climate change as a security issues. And given the recent changes in the geopolitical situation in Asia-Pacific or in Indo-Pacific, Japan have to secure the regional partnership, so such as the ASEAN or the Pacific Island countries. So they try to strengthen the ties with the regions by providing support or doing the joint initiative. So this is really critical for Japan's, which is not so much having energy resources or the kind of resources to achieve the carbon neutrality. So yeah, this is something that I wanted to add.
Tino, for India, surprising thing that came out in our report is that the kind of green partnerships, the strategic partnerships that India is keen to negotiate and sign are all with developed countries, right? Europe, they have a green partnership with Denmark. The India-US clean energy partnership is now accelerating, it's growing. What do you attribute that interest to, and what's driving India's own engagement with a lot of the developed partners as opposed to the developing countries on climate?
I think it's part of a dual track upstream and downstream climate diplomacy, where the upstream is far more developed and ahead, but I wouldn't neglect the downstream one. I think the upstream one is driven by that first fact I mentioned, FDI attraction in particular, trade, given that these global north economies are far ahead the curve on climate, given that they have not always been very good at co-developing taxonomies and roping partners in. That's something India complains about a lot, particularly with the European Union. I think India realizes that it needs to accelerate that outreach to prepare for the next few decades of economic growth. So that means EU, that means France, by the way, too. That means Japan, that means smaller countries like Denmark. Now, whether there's a particular strategy that animates all of this, I'm not sure, but that is the broader objective, I think, that is driving India's initiatives in terms of green and climate partnerships with OECD economies. But downstream, Kartik, there's also, I think, some interesting developments. And I think that's why I'm glad that we're doing some work now at CSEP and the report about these triangular climate partnerships, which again I mentioned as one of the drivers of India's climate diplomacy, which means that India wants to sort of provide also climate-centric or climate-informed development solutions that are affordable, scalable, and adaptable for a variety of emerging economies. that are relatively behind the curve and even maybe behind India's curve. I mean, India's done relatively well on the Paris commitments, for example, and is well placed towards 2030 in its first commitments, set of commitments. So I think that is maybe what explains that first focus towards the north. And I would even argue it's actually still too little, right? In fact, that's the anxiety currently in Delhi, that it's still behind the curve because these bilateral partnerships have not necessarily translated into much. I mean, unless you, for example, able to finally take forward the EU-India FTA negotiations, which are nowhere near any bright horizon, it'll be very difficult to do growth through interdependence in line with the growing and dense and deeper requirements from the global north economies on the transition.
So we have about a few more minutes before we open up for questions. I want to just maybe talk a little bit about the challenges in this context of climate diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. And just maybe broadly, what do you think are some of the constraints and concerns that countries will face when it comes to generating capital, when it comes to acquiring the different kinds of technologies to facilitate their own energy transitions? What are some geopolitical structural factors do you think we should keep in mind as countries negotiate on climate through different frameworks and engagements? Maybe Sharon, I'll start with you. We are in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia is in the middle of all the geopolitical action now.
I think climate is an issue that no one can afford to take sides in. So in view of the geopolitical rivalry, and I've written a piece about this as well, about US-China cooperation in climate change. I think that's one thing that they have tried very hard, both sides, to ring fence. And for that, there's appreciation, I think, from countries in the region and around the world that they've tried to ring fence that. And last year, when we saw that, things were not going so well between the US and China until the San Francisco meeting, then things started to open up again. The discussions started to happen again. But to be fair to the two parties, I do think that they've really tried behind the scenes to, work very hard on some of the climate issues. And I hope that that continues, whether it's with a different presidency at the White House, that will continue to be so, and they will continue to ring fence that relationship and work on climate issues. Of course, there's always that danger that, if we have a different president, that he might do a repeat of the pullout from the Paris Agreement and so on. And we try to comfort ourselves, right? We say that, oh, no. So even if the US were to pull out from the Paris Agreement, the subnational governments will still continue to do the work and so on. But still symbolically, it doesn't look, it's not good for the region. So that's the geopolitical risk there. And the risk, of course, is that, climate security issues often have to take a back seat, right, to the immediate unfolding issues that we are confronted with, such as the Russia-Ukraine war, the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, and then the potential hotspots in Southeast Asia. I think those are very worrying, and oftentimes, the geopolitical analysts tend to just relegate climate change right to the back, even though it's going to be an issue that will come right to the fore in the future. So,
are there concerns about the green industrial policies in Europe and the United States in Southeast Asia, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the different kinds of efforts in Europe underway, and the effects of that, especially as countries yet try to decarbonize faster?
Yeah. I think some of these policies do carry some unintended consequences on innocent bystander countries, like here in ASEAN. The Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, has certain provisions on manufacturing of components that must be made, like a certain percentage made in the US or by like-minded countries. And that poses a problem for, countries that are trading here from Southeast Asia, where they want to be exporting, but they can't meet some of these requirements. So in that sense, it's a bit of a disguised protectionism in the domestic laws. So, I mean, it's within their sovereign right to decide what to do and to propagate some of these policies. But then when you do that and you adversely affect the genuine partners that want to work with you, it makes things difficult for them. So I think there's got to be a bit more consultation and dialogue with different countries. The other one is the EU CBAM, for instance, is also causing ripple effects in the region. And some of the countries have spoken out against the kind of protectionist stance that the EU CBAM has taken. And I know that EU countries have been also, coming to the region and trying to explain how that all works. On the one hand, you can see the EU CBAM as a way to increase the standards, to improve the standards, of the developing south, of the developing countries in the region. But on the other hand, when you do it too quickly, then it affects them, and and you have to extend some assistance for them to meet up to some of these standards.
Nagisa?
Because my major interest is climate change adaptation, I want to highlight this point. So as I touched on, the climate change is highly tangled with security risk management. So the countries is now trying to strategically providing support for the countries which are most vulnerable to build a resilience in response to climate change. But if it's getting too strategic, it will be really hard to reach out to the most vulnerable populations or most vulnerable groups of people. Though I would like to highlight that the climate change is quite different from other development agendas. It has a Paris Agreement, which call for the support for the country which are most vulnerable. So I would say development assistance is the key to raise the resilience to climate change worldwide. But it could be also seeing the overarching targets of the Paris Agreement to achieve the resilience pathway as the whole world. So Japan has revised the development assistance charter last year, and it's mentioned the promoting the FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific region by through the development assistance. So I think, as I said, they are trying to support the vulnerable countries such as the Pacific Island or Southeast Asian countries. But the kind of adaptations or resilience buildings could be the really important the agendas for the development assistance because it could be mainstreamed into the existing effort on the development assistance. So Japan has a lot of knowledge on disaster risk reduction because it's itself really prone to the natural disaster risks. So as Japanese government is promoting the technology or experience, know-how, and knowledge, so Japan could be taking a lead of the adaptation initiative in the region. So yeah, this is one of the challenges that I want to emphasize here in this panel. Thank you.
Tino, big picture, geopolitics, what matters most for India? And if you can also briefly touch upon the CBAM discussion, which has come back strongly in India domestically. There's been a lot of talk and discussion about the effects of CBAM.
Yeah, let me actually start exactly with that. CBAM, but also the massive fiscal revenue loss for India, right? In terms of the clean green. That is on the mind of every policymaker and politician that is going to represent 1.3 billion people at any level, central, state, local. So it'll have a massive impact on the growth prospects of India. So whatever's happening in terms of carbon taxes or in terms of the transition towards renewable energies and the loss of the Indian government in terms of being able to do what it does best, which is taxing coal, gas, and oil, right? And if you look at that is how you run the government, and that has a variety of political economy challenges to it. That is going to become that is a current challenge. And I think what you'll see there happening is India pushing more and more aggressively for climate finance abroad. That will come in only two possible ways. One, very low probability, which is a reinvention of multilateral development banks and a growing climate focus there. Good luck with that. I think we all figured out it's not going to come from there, or whatever is going to come from that source. It is not going to be enough to compensate for India's challenge at home. So the private sector will be a second possible avenue. I expect India is going to be focusing much more on that. Now, the challenge there, Kartik, as I see it, is something not different from what happened with India's accession to the non-proliferation regime in the 2000s on the nuclear regime. We had a robust regime from which India was excluded. It was legally impossible for India to accede to it. How did it happen? Geopolitics and politics, right? The US, European countries, Japan supported India's accession partial into a hybrid regime that is being transformed. I think that is a possible avenue. What I mean is that the current taxonomy standards and rules that we have in the global climate regime on climate finance will have to give way in one way or the other. And that requires political support and geopolitical ability. Let's see if it happens, but that is one possibility. The other, let me be a bit facetious, but the other opportunity I see actually, compared to what Sharon was saying, is I think let me be slightly bit counterintuitive here. I think a Trump election later this year would actually activate further proactive climate diplomacy from India. A Biden re-election may slightly complicate things. What I mean is that India is much more comfortable working without pressure sometimes. And assuming Trump will drop out, it puts the ball again in the court of India and ASEAN and many in Japan and other countries. And that's not necessarily bad. They will push these countries to have to deliver without the US in the lead, maybe, or if it ever was in the lead. That's also discussable, by the way. But I think I see a little bit of an opportunity there in some ways. I'm being a little bit provocative, but I think there has been a tendency, at least in India, in that sense, to perform much better when it is not under pressure, etc. And the last point I just want to make and leave, since we're in Singapore, is grid connectivity. Not only within regions, ASEAN Power Grid has done formidable progress. And it's not a coincidence that it has able to be doing it now, because now the private sector is interested. There is a green horizon. This needs to be done. But within South Asia also, we're talking finally about grid connectivity when there's feasibility studies that have been done for decades. But it's happening now between India and Nepal, between India and Bangladesh, between India and Sri Lanka. So within the region, this is happening. I think the next challenge, and I see indications of this happening already, is going to be connectivity in some ways between the South and the Southeast Asian grids. And there are a variety of studies that point to the benefits to accelerate climate action from doing that. Singapore in particular, as we know, is very interested in underwater sea cables and connecting. So I think what we call also the BIMSTEC region, but also with Southeast Asian countries. So I think that's maybe an opportunity we should think more of in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to open the floor now for questions. And maybe we can start off with 2 or 3 and then go from there. The back, Sumana.
Sumana from the Economist Intelligence Unit. A question to Dr. Xavier about India's green transition domestically, and how that it will affect its climate diplomacy. So, to simplify, rich Indian states, they are the ones that are sunny and windy, right? And the poor states in India have lots of coal and they have lots of other minerals, right? And you look at, you talked about affordable solutions at scale. Almost 75% of solar and wind capacity in India has been installed in southern and western states, so the richer ones. And it doesn't seem like the central government really has thought about what the transition means from an economic standpoint domestically. So just transition, there's a possibility that it would make India more unequal. So, what do you think of the transition domestically, given this dynamic, and what is the effects on climate diplomacy? Thank
you. Ambassador Karim? Scott?
2 points. One is a comment, and the other is a question directed particularly to Tino. The comment is that, the climate diplomacy, we are trying to now scale it down from the global to the regional or the larger regional when you talk of Indo-Pacific. But even that is going to be a big challenge because there are regions in the Indo-Pacific which are at loggerheads with each other over how they will approach it. And of course, the smaller issues within the negotiations of who's going to give how much money and who's going to get how much of that money is actually distracted the whole process of the world addressing what needs to be done, mitigation. So you bring down the level of warming and stop it from crossing 1.5. But we are already very close to reaching that point, much earlier than anticipated. So bringing down to the regional, and you raised a very good point, the regional cooperative efforts and the recent developments that have taken place between India and Nepal and Bhutan and Bangladesh. There is a larger region, I think. If you look at the Himalayas, the Eastern Himalayas have 3 rivers, and they feed virtually entire South and Southeast Asia. And the Himalayas have an ice mass. They've lost 40% of this ice mass, which took 2,000 years to accumulate. And they're likely to lose that 80% of this, particularly Nepal and Bhutan area, by 2100. That has huge consequences, geopolitical consequences, geostrategic consequences, human consequences. And so perhaps we need to tailor down our negotiations and focus on the regional and include the local at the local ground level to see how we can do our own mitigation efforts while the larger, slanging out in the larger forum of, I need so much money and you're not giving enough money, will carry on. Thank you.
And Kate?
Thank you very much for your the presentations. Those are the really important and interesting. I have the questions toward the I think the Sharon and then also the Shiba-san, and then probably the Tino could actually touch on that. So decarbonization is the most one of the most important kind of the issues in climate change. And then in order to do that, probably like you need to actually find out the way to do this. And then the nuclear energy is the one of the most important issue where I think by which the in which I think the Philippines now and also the Thailand are particularly interested in getting that. Now, the Japan and the United States actually made a certain kind of like agreement that they are going to collaborate in order to export its nuclear technology in terms of the nuclear energy and last year. So does it actually have something you may be concerned about? Because the nuclear reactor or like nuclear energy is the not existing in the Southeast Asia yet. And then the maybe like this would actually create certain the concern, like the Japan experienced the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, and then there's a certain kind of accident that like you may be actually the not expecting, but then that is a kind of one of the concerns when you are getting the nuclear energy. So the one is the for the Shannon, like is this actually something that concerned from the Southeast Asian perspective, like getting the nuclear weapon, nuclear issue energies in the particular the countries in Southeast Asia. And then the second thing is, does it actually exacerbate the geopolitical competition between the Japan, United States, and then also China? Because that could create a certain competition in the selling or like the transferring the nuclear technology in the Southeast Asia. So these are the something geopolitical concerns and also the safety concerns that like you may actually could if you could touch on that, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Tino, start with you.
I think both first questions were a bit related on the domestic and the regional one. And I don't see how we can change geography in the logic of comparative advantage. If some states have sun, a lot of sun, is not naturally going to explore that. If other states within a country are windy, you'll have, development of the energy sector there. As long as that is integrated into one economy, yes, there are risks, of course, of new technological development or resources leading to what I guess you would call a resource curse or something. But I don't see it as challenging as you put it, maybe. I think if Jharkhand has coal, then you'll mine there. And if Gujarat has sun, you'll develop one of the largest solar parks in the world. And the rest is political economy and redistribution of growth, whether those are challenges that exist across any economic area, including on this one on energies. Not that they don't exist, but it's nothing new. So I don't see a particular risk in that increasing inequity within the country more than it exists or in other sectors. And I extend it to the region because it's the same about the region. If Nepal has hydro, if Sri Lanka is trying to decarbonize through offshore wind, for example, these are comparative advantages of the countries that if they fit the larger decarbonization strategy within the region, they will lead to benefits for all countries and based on their competitive advantages and to growth prospects. And the only way to do this, and I want to underline this because I think it is clear, maybe clearer to us in this region and maybe clearer even to me and my colleagues because we're sitting in India and next door Bangladesh, which is the 8th largest country in the world. It is about to graduate into a low middle income country by 26, for example, is that the only way to perform meaningful climate action is if you tie it with profit-making incentives and growth prospects for the companies, for the people. And that will drive it. So the more and more we think about that, the more I think naturally this will happen. There's no free lunches if you want, despite geopolitical interests. And that's where geopolitics actually makes sense sometimes. They bring in a competitive edge of countries that need to deliver better, faster to accelerate the transition, if it is such an important issue, right, for the global good. And to Mr. Karim's question, Ambassador Karim's question also, it has to happen at all levels. Absolutely, sir. In sub-regional, in fact, is I think the one you focused on very rightly. Clusters of countries within the region. And ASEAN, I guess, too. If you look at the end power grid, it's Cambodia, sorry, it's a Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, right? 4 countries that took the lead on that. It's not the whole entire group of 10 countries. So sub-regional, regional, and I'd like to emphasize, and that's why I mentioned the ASEAN South Asia Grid Connectivity Challenge, inter-regional, which requires us to think out of our boxes much more, which is again is a welcome development, right? These ideas have been around for a long time, but they're actually happening now because there is an urgency, an immaterial urgency of climate transition, but also very material interest in making this happen, whether it's geopolitics or profit for private capital. And let me just say one more last thing on the nuclear one, so I can end with that, Kartik. I think it's a great point because it's part of that larger basket that countries have to address, and India is addressing in particular. Nuclear has been stagnant in India's energy mix, but there's now a lot of thinking happening on that. And not so much the larger reactors, but the smaller modular reactors now. The French are trying it, old style, but I think Japan would be very welcome in India currently to develop into a new niche segment on nuclear. Now, there's, of course, reluctances on the Japanese side and questions, but this is a question also about technology, right? And to what extent there can be these technological partnerships that have a multiply effect on any policy, climate in particular. And I'm thinking of these variety of tech partnerships that India is signing now. You're doing some work on this, Kartik, but the ISET with India, with the US, for example, Initiative of Critical and Emerging Technologies. These are going to be tremendously transformative partnerships that India is signing. In fact, India is wanting to sign one with Japan. And hopefully that will be happening soon, because those are the catalytic developments that will then help use technology for climate purposes, to transfer technology or co-develop technology for right initiatives, including climate.
Sharon, do you want to speak?
Yeah. So actually, because I work mainly on mitigation, and I've actually been looking at the power grid issues, and I agree with you. The sub-regional cooperative mechanisms are extremely important. And in fact, did you know that China has a global energy initiative, a global energy connectivity initiative, in addition to its GCI, GSI, GDI? How many more I's? This is another I that they have, which actually sets out a very ambitious project, right, to connect all the power grids together, which is in theory fantastic. But then, you know, in practice, extremely difficult. Because if you were to connect bilaterally, that's easy. But to do it plurilaterally and multilaterally, that's very difficult. Why? Because you have to reform. You have to, there's again, no pain, no gain. You have to, you know, accept some pain in reforming your electricity markets and setting standards, harmonizing, making sure your grid codes talk to each other, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work to do. But I think it's all worth it, because ultimately in mitigation and in energy, even if you were to use every conceivable means to tap into renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal, etc., you still need a base load of consistent energy. And your base load can either come from conventional sources, you know, fuel like coal, LNG, and so on, or it can come from clean sources, nuclear energy. So, you know, assuming if everyone could connect up, then we wouldn't all need to be, you know, building our own nuclear power plants and just tap into one or two in every region, right? To power ourselves up and give ourselves that base load so that your intermittency can be managed. So I'm going a little bit technical. But on the nuclear part, I do think that in the region, ASEAN has been talking about nuclear safety and nuclear civilian nuclear energy for the last 30 years. In fact, they have a subsector network. It's called the ASEAN Nuclear Safety Subsector Network. And policymakers from the energy and the trade and commerce ministries actually come together to talk about it. So I think the level of awareness at the policy-making realm is quite high, and they understand that what happened in Fukushima was not technology related. It's actually a disaster, you know, a natural disaster that's happened. And now the discussion in the region is, like as you said, it's also moving towards the SMRs. And SMRs are presenting themselves as a feasible option for countries to tap into clean. Debate is out there about whether it's renewable, but clean energy sources to help Southeast Asia decarbonize itself. And in the survey that we do, 5.6% of regional respondents actually think that nuclear can be an option for the region. And of this group, Singaporeans have the highest opinion. About 15% of Singapore respondents say that it's a potential energy source. Why? Because Singapore is so alternative energy disadvantaged that they are willing to consider any option to help us decarbonize ourselves. Safety concerns, in a way, yes, the NIMBY, not in my backyard kind of syndrome will still be around, and it will definitely still be in the public perception. But all ASEAN countries are members of the IEA and they have signed up to the different conventions. And if the IEA was, I believe it still is very much fit for purpose in this area of nuclear energy and nuclear safety, we will be able to abide by them. And ASEAN has been working over the last 30 years, also has drafted a certain set of understanding within itself about nuclear energy. So I think some of these concerns can be mitigated. And right now, the climate imperative makes it attractive, you know, makes nuclear attractive for all of us. So these things can be managed. Yeah.
Thank you. Lisa?
So, any concerns about nuclear energy? Sharon and Tina has already provided the great insights, so I shouldn't say much. But yes, the nuclear power production is seen as a clean energy, and it's highlighted at COP28 as well. So there is a group of government which promote or which set the ambitious goal of the nuclear power production capacity. But yeah, Japan has a lot of public oppositions so far. So this is one of the concerns. But the GX Promotion Act of the Japanese government, the nuclear power production is one of the core pillars of the way forward, the GX. Yeah, I think how to manage the public opinions on nuclear power is one of the points, and also it shouldn't undermine the effort for the renewable energy installations as well. So yeah, I think it's a really sensitive topic, and also among G7 countries, there is different views on the nuclear power. For example, Germany has really hesitant to push the nuclear power forward. So that kind of divide might not be shouldn't be the obstacles of the reaching the agreement of the climate and the energy agendas for the G7 countries. So yeah, this is my opinion.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Your point about cost.
Yes.
Because he asked about exporting nuclear technology, Japan and US. I think ultimately the standards are great. The perceptions of Japanese and US standards are high, but it will come down the wire to cost, because China also has great technology and they can export at much lower cost to the region. And again, price takers cannot choose and pick, so they'll just go where the wallet allows them to.
Great. So we started a little late. Are there any final burning questions? Yep, Pushpa. Thank you, Karthik. I think it's not a burning question, but perhaps I wanted to ask Tina is here. You mentioned about this recent development, the sub-regional one in South Asia, and I think there are some very good ones, the grid connectivity, the agreement between Nepal and India, the long-term power purchase agreement, right? But there are also apprehensions, given the long-term, relationships and the way that the clean energy itself is also being taken as a strategic good, as people would see it that way. For example, now India has a guideline in terms of how they would purchase electricity from its neighbors. Clearly, like Chinese investment in Nepal in any electricity project will not be, India will not buy electricity from that particular project. Not even that, actually, there was an instance where India refused to buy electricity from a project in which Chinese contractors were involved, right? So there is some apprehension about these are very encouraging developments that have taken place, but will they really go forward? If electricity will be taken as a strategy good in this particular manner, what will be the state of this cooperation that we are seeing at the moment? So how would you see that? What is your take on that?
A little bit more optimistic than yours for a change, but I see. I think technically, the law does not impede India from buying it. It requires extra clearance if it comes from a source detained with a majority stake by another foreign investor in Nepal. And that relates to energy security concerns that I think are natural for all countries, right? You importing upstream, you don't want to have shutoffs or the weaponization of a resource that leads to your economic growth, right? In fact, particularly with a neighbor that we know has weaponized goods before, whether it's tourism, currency, in this case, possibly water. right? So that is, I think, just a natural, I think, and security interest that all states have, and the downstream India will have. Now, if that is a precondition for India to finally deliver on something it should have done 20, 30 years ago, that seems to me like a win-win approach, right? That you're finally injecting international finance into Nepal to develop the hydro sector, which is happening formidably. I mean, just projects we thought of 1960s, are finally happening. We talk 50 years of a lost potential. In fact, as you know, the appetite for hydro now is lower than it's ever been for a variety of reasons, right? So unfortunately, that window is sort of also closing. But still, if that is happening, if India is able to, therefore, if it helps the decarbonization of India's energy sector, and of Bangladesh, by the way, too, if finally we're having those agreements, I think I see a bit more light than darkness in terms of the prospects of that happening and being commensurate with some trade-offs on both sides and losses. But by the way, note of caution, I mean, grid connectivity is not necessarily decarbonization, right? So India, Bangladesh are connecting their grids, and it's mostly very dirty coal, right? That is connecting. So I think the challenge has to go far beyond just grid connectivity, but it increases by a scale of a big scale the prospects for decarbonization, because it connects grids with various, as I mentioned, comparative advantages across the subcontinent and between two regions, including with the time zones, etc. There's a lot of advantages there.
Great, thank you so much. So we've covered a lot here today, and this is an increasingly important topic, not just for countries in Asia, but everywhere. But just one final point that kind of I got out of the discussion today is that, look, the geopolitical tensions in this part of the world are not going anywhere. COPs are going to be remaining, they will remain as important as ever. But in this broader context, there's going to be a lot of experimentation. There's going to be a lot of space for countries, as Tina mentioned, to navigate and figure out how they can work with one another on issues like climate, health, technology. The Quad is one part of that. And on other issues, there are going to be other kinds of frameworks that are emerging that will enable countries to advance their own interests. But eventually, particularly on climate, I think the hard work has to be done at home. And I think that's the base from which countries can also work diplomatically on these issues, whether it's grid connectivity, whether it's nuclear, whether it's generating and acquiring enough capital for their own climate transitions. It's important to just also focus a lot on what's happening at home across South and Southeast Asia and how that affects and influences how countries behave diplomatically on issues like climate. With that, I hope please join me in thanking our great panel who have come here and to talk about this issue. And thank you all for joining us today as well.